History of the Communist Party of the United States by William Z. Foster A.T. 5. HFFFIO. Contents. Preface. Early American Class Struggles, 1793 to 1848. Jeffersonian Democracy, 16. The Beginnings of the Trade Union Movement, 18. Labor's First Steps Toward Independent Political Action, 20. Ideology of the Early Labor Movement, 21. Utopian Socialism, 22. Pioneer Marxists in the United States, 1848 to 1860. German Marxist Immigrants, 27. Wedemeyer, Pioneer of American Socialism, 28. The Proletarian League, 29. Formation of the Communist Club, 31. Laying the Theoretical Foundations of Marxism in the U.S., 32. Marxists in the Struggle Against Slavery, 1848 to 1865. The Abolitionist Movement, 37. The Role of the Marxists, 38. The Maturing of the Crisis, 40. The Election of Abraham Lincoln, 41. The Civil War, 43. The Negro People and the Working Class in the War, 45. Role and Strategy of the Marxists in the War Period, 47. The International Workingmen's Association, 1864 to 1876. From Revolution to Counter-Revolution, 50. The Marxists and the National Labor Union, 53. The NLU and the Negro Question, 54. The NLU and the First International, 56. The Decline of the National Labor Union, 56. The Marxists and the Lassalleans, 58. Dissolution of the First International, 60. The Socialist Labor Party, 1876 to 1890. The SLP and the Great Railroad Strike, 63. Workers and Farmers. 10. Political Struggles, 64. The Anarcho-Syndicalist Movement, 66. The Knights of Labor, 68. The American Federation of Labor, 69. The National 8-Hour Fight, 71. The Henry George Campaign, 73. The Status of the SLP in 1890, 74. The SLP, de Leonism in Decline, 1890 to 1900. Fierce Labor Struggles, 78. The Role of De Leon, 79. The SLP and the Trade Unions, 82. The Socialist Trades and Labor Alliance, 84. Labor Party and Populist Movement, 85. The SLP and the Negro, 86. The Decline of the Socialist Labor Party, 88. The Split in the SLP, 89. The Socialist Party, 1900 to 1905. Corruption of the AF of L. Leadership, 92. Formation of the Socialist Party, 94. The Socialist Party Program, 95. The Employers' Open Shop Offensive, 97. Socialist Party Activity, 98. The Formation of the IWW, 100. The Status of the Party, 101. The Party's Chauvinist Negro Policy, 103. Opportunist Influence of the Second International, 105. The Heyday of the Socialist Party, 1905 to 1914. The Conditions of the Workers, 108. The Fight of the Trade Unions, 109. The Struggle of the IWW, 110. Growth of the Socialist Party, 112. Renaissance of the Negro Liberation Movement, 114. Formation of the Syndicalist League, 117. The New Freedom and the Square Deal, 118. Lefts versus Rights in the Party, 119. The SP Split in 1912, 122. The Status of the Left Wing, 123. World War I. Social Democratic Betrayal, 1914 to 1918. The Great Social Democratic Betrayal, 128. The U.S. During the early years of the war, 130. The U.S. joins the war, 132. The Socialists and the war, 134. The IWW and the war, 136. The ITUEL, 137. Government terror against the left, 140. The Russian Revolution, 1917 to 1919. U.S. intervention, 144. The Social Democrats betray the revolution, 145. Impact of the revolution on the American labor movement, 147. The Teachings of Marxism-Leninism, 148. Marxism-Leninism and the American Marxists, 151. 11. 42. 13. 14. A5. 16. The Split in the Socialist Party, 1919. The Long Internal Struggle, 157. The Immediate Causes of the 1919 Split, 158. The Relationship of Party Forces, 160. The Developing Struggle, 161. Hillquits, Pink Terror, 163. The National Left-Wing Conference, 164. The Left-Wing Manifesto, 166. The Decline of the Socialist Party, 169. The Formation of the Communist Party, 1919 to 1921. The Two Communist Conventions, 171. The Communist Programs, 172. The Palmer Raids, 174. Formation of the United Communist Party, 177. The Role of the Communist International, 178. Party Unity achieved, 180. Concentrating the Communist Forces, 182. The Workers' Party, 1921. The American Labor Alliance, 187. The Workers' Council, 188. Formation of the Workers' Party, 189. The Workers' Pandy Program, 191. The party asserts its democratic rights, 194. The Communists and the Capitalist Offensive, 1919 to 1923. The first blow falls upon the left, 198. The drive against the trade unions, 198. Misleaders of labor, 201. The Communist Party breaks its isolation, go to. Early activities of the TUEL, 203. Mass campaigns of the TUEL, 205. The AF of L. Convention of 1933, 207. Defense of class war prisoners, 208. The Communists and the Lafayette Movement, 1922 to 1924. The Developing Lafayette Movement, 213. The Workers' Party and the Farmer Labor Party, 215. The Federated Farmer Labor Party Convention, 216. The Farmer Labor Party, 217. Tactical Mistakes of the Workers' Party, 219. Factionalism in the Workers' Party, 221. The Death of Lenin, 223. Toward Negro-White Labor Solidarity, 1919 to 1924. The Garvey Movement, 226. Attempts to divide Negro and White workers, 228. Growing unity between Negro and white workers, 230. The Communists and Negro-White Cooperation, 232. A New Stage in the Negro People's Movement, 234. Ls 18, 19, 20. Zoo. A. F. of L. Class Collaboration during the Coolidge Prosperity, 1923 to 1929. The Speed-Up, or Rationalization, Drive, 237. The Unions as Speed-Up Agencies of the Bosses, 239. Ford vs. Marx, 240. The Higher Strategy of Labor, 242. Degeneration of the Labor Bureaucracy, 243. The Bill of Reckoning, 245. Communist Class Struggle Policies, 1923 to 1929. The Expulsion Policy, 248. Hard-Fought Textile Strikes, 250. The Needle Trades Strikes, 272. The Struggle in the Mining Industry, 255. Formation of the TUUL, 257. International Labor Unity, 259. Building the Party of the New Type, 1919 to 1929. Party Work Among Women and the Youth, 263. The Death of Ruthenberg, 264. The Sixth World Congress of the Comintern, 265. The Negro Question as a National Question, 266. The American Negro Labor Congress, 268. The Expulsion of the Trotskyites, 269. Lovestone and Exceptionalism, 270. The Unification of the Party, 274. The Communist Party in the Great Economic Crisis, 1929 to 1933. Marxists anticipate the crisis and gird for the storm, 277. Hoover's Starvation Policies, 279. AF of L and SP. Political Bankruptcy, 280. The Communists Lead the Mass Struggle, March 6, 281. Unemployed Councils and Hunger Marches, 282. The Fight Against Wage Cuts, 284. The Penetration of the South, 285. The Farmers' Revolt, 288. The National Bonus March, 289. The Presidential Elections of 1932, 290. The Status of the Party and the YKA, 291. Early Struggles under the New Deal, 1933 to 1936. Why Not Fascism in the U.S., 295. The National Industrial Recovery Act, 296. Beginning of the Mass Struggle, 297. The Big Strike Movement of 1934 to 36, 298. The San Francisco General Strike, 300. The TUUL merges with the AF of L, 303. The formation of the CI0, 304. The Growing Communist Party, 307. Pei, Z5, 24. Al, 26. A. The Broad Democratic Struggle, 1933 to 1936. The National Negro Congress, 308. The American Youth Congress, 309. The Women's Movement, Giz. The Panacea, Mass Movements, 314. The Cultural Upsurge, 317. The Seventh Comintern, Congress and the Roosevelt Coalition, 320. The Communist Party in the Nation, 323. Roosevelt and Wall Street, 1933 to 1936. Wall Street's Attack upon the New Deal, 326. The American Liberty League, 327. Roosevelt Fights Back, 328. The Elections of 1936, 330. Labor in the Elections, 332. The Political Line of the Communist Party, 334. Browder and American Democratic Traditions, 336. The Communists in the Building of the CIO, 1936 to 1940. The AF of L. Leaders sabotage the campaign, 342. Labor's Solidarity overcomes all obstacles, 343. The role of the Communist Party, 345. The Communists in the Steel Industry, 349. The Communists in the Auto Industry, 351. The Communists and Progressives in Other Industries, 353. The Good Neighbor Policy, 1933 to 1941. The Yankee Record of Exploitation and Tyranny, 357. American Imperialism Gets a New Look, 359. The Stunted Economy of Latin America, 360. The Exploited and Famished Peoples of Latin America, 362. The Latin American Peoples Fight Against Fascism, 363. The Communist Party in Latin America, 365. The Fight Against Fascism in War, 1935 to 1939. The Soviets for Collective Security, 369. The People's Front, 370. The Spanish Civil War, 371. Munich and War, 373. The U.S. and the War, 375. The American People, Anti-Fascist and Anti-War, 377. The Elections of 1938, 379. The Growth of the Communist Party, 380. World War II. The Early War Phases, 1939 to 1941. The Phony War, 384. American Reactions to the War, 386. The Communist Position on the War, 387. Roosevelt Heads Toward War. Z.B. ZA. 30. O.L. Bay 389. The 1940 Elections, 390. Persecution of the Party, 391. The America First Committee, 393. Hitler Marches Toward Disaster, 394. World War II. The People's Anti-Fascist. WAR. 1941 to 1945. The Great German Offensive, 397. The Japanese Attack upon Pearl Harbor, 398. The Soviets March to Victory, 398. The Question of the Western Front, 400. The War Against Japan, 40 grams. An Estimate of World War II, 404. The Communists in the War, 1941 to 1945. The Battle for Production, 410. The Fight for the Second Front, 412. The Fair Employment Practices Commission, 413. The Dissolution of the Communist International, 414. Opportunist Conception of National Unity, 415. Browder's Plan for Organized Capitalism, 417. Browder's Opportunism and the Chinese Revolution, 419. The Party and the Masses, 420. The Communist Political Association, 1944-1945. The Essence of Browder's Opportunism, 425. How Browder's Reaganism Originated, 427. Foster Opposes Browder's Line, 428. Dissolution of the Communist Party, 430. Effects upon Mass Work, 432. Growing Opposition in the CPA, 433. The Duclos Article, 434. The Emergency Convention, 435. The Expulsion of Browder, 437. The Revolutionary Aftermath of the WAR, 1945 to 1951. The Advance of the Soviet Union, 439. The Rise of the European People's Democracies, 441. The People's Revolution in China, 442. The Advance of the American Negro People, 444. The World Federation of Trade Unions, 446. World Organizations of Women and Youth, 447. The Post-War Upsurge Among Cultural Workers, 448. The Growth of the Communist Parties, 449. The Capitalist and Socialist Worlds, 451. American Imperialism Drives for World Mastery, 1948 to 1951. American Capitalist Hegemony, 452. Forces Behind Wall Street's War Drive, 454. The Peace Will of the Peoples, 457. The U.S. Pushes OS 34, 3D 36, IE Toward War, 459. The Trend Toward Fascism, 463. Building a Police State in the U.S., 465. The Communist Party in the Cold War, 1945 to 1951. The Nine-Party Communist Conference, 470. The 1948 elections, 471. The Panty in the Korean War, 473. Anti-war activities of the party, 474. The Communists and the Negro People, 476. The formation of the Labor Youth League, 479. The Communists and the Republic of Israel, 479. FHE Question of Keynesism, 481. The Party meets the test, 484. American imperialism hobbles the trade union movement, 1945 to 1951. The Taft-Hartley Law, 487. Labor and the Marshall Plan, 489. The split in the C 1.0, 491. The AF of L circa 1.0. Attack upon the CTAL, 495. The attempt to wreck the WFTU, 496. The crisis of the American labor movement, 500. The independent unions, 503. Persecution of the Communist Party, 1945 to 1951. The sharpening attack against the left, 506. The indictment of the Communist Party, 509. A political persecution, 510. The government's case, 511. The party fights back, 514. The Supreme Court sustains the frame-up, 516. Multiplying raids and persecutions, 518. The McCarran Act, 519. The situation of the Communist Party, 521. Victory ahead for the people. What if war comes? 526. A suicidal war for capitalism, 528. The decay of world capitalism, 530. The U.S. and the general crisis, 533. Bourgeois culture in the crisis, 535. Socialism, the basic answer, 537. The American working class in socialism. Factors retarding the ideological development of the workers, 542. Factors making for class consciousness, 544. The impoverishment of the workers, 545. The workers will turn to socialism, 547. The American Road to Socialism, 549. Lessons of Communist World Experience, 557. 38. The Party of the Working Class and the Nation. The Communist Party as Working Class Leader, 560. The Communist Party and the Negro People, 562. The Communist Party and other democratic strata, 563. The Communist Party, the Party of the Nation, 564. Socialism in the National Interest, 566. The Party's immediate demands, 567. The Progress of the Communist Party, 570. Acknowledgements. The author wishes to thank all those who helped in the preparation of this history of the Communist Party. Their cooperation covered a wide range of work, extensive research in many fields, the writing of various studies, and the reading and correcting of the manuscript and proofs. Of especially great value were the large number of penetrating criticisms and constructive proposals made by these co-workers, without which this history could not have been written. William Z. Foster. Pi, AML, YT. 1. Early American Class Struggles, 1793 to 1848. The history of the Communist Party of the United States is the history of the vanguard party of the American working class. It is the story and analysis of the origin, growth, and development of a working-class political party of a new type, called into existence by the epoch of imperialism, the last stage of capitalism, and by the emergence of a new social system, socialism. It is the record of a party which through its entire existence of more than 3 decades has loyally fought for the best interests of the American working class and its allies, the Negro people, the toiling farmers, the city middle classes, who are the great majority of the American people. It is the life of a party destined to lead the American working class and its allies to victory over the monopoly warmongers and fascists, to a people's democracy and socialism. The life story of the Communist Party is also the history of Marxism for a century in the United States. The CPUSA is the inheritor and continuer of the many American Marxist parties and organizations which preceded it during this long period. It incorporates in itself the lessons of generations of political struggle by the working class, of the world experience of the First, Second, and Third Internationals, of the writings of the great socialist theoreticians, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and of the great revolutions in Russia, China, and Central and Eastern Europe. It is also the continuation and culmination of American scientific, democratic, and artistic culture, embracing and carrying forward all that is sound and constructive in the works of Franklin, Jefferson, Douglas, Lincoln, Morgan, Edison, Twain, Dreiser, and a host of American thinkers, writers, and creators. The party history is the record of the American class struggle, of which it is a vital part. It is the story, in general, of the growth of the working class, the abolition of slavery and emancipation of the Negro people, the building of the trade union and farmer movements, the numberless strikes and political struggles of the toiling masses, and the growing political alliance of workers, Negroes, farmers, and intellectuals. The party is the crystallization of the best in all these rich democratic and revolutionary traditions of the people. It is the embodiment of the toilers' aspirations for freedom and a better life. The story of the Communist Party is also necessarily the history, in outline, of American capitalism. It is the account and analysis of the revolutionary liberation from British domination and establishment of the Republic, the expansion of the national frontiers, the development of industry and agriculture, the armed overthrow of the Southern slavocracy, the recurring economic crises, the brutal exploitation of the workers, the poles of wealth and poverty, the growth of monopoly and development of imperialism, the savage robbery of the colonial peoples, the great world wars, the barbarities of fascism, the bid of American imperialism for world domination, the fight of the people for world peace, the general crisis of capitalism, and the development of the world-class struggle, under expanding Marxist-Leninist leadership, toward socialism. Jeffersonian democracy. The American Revolution of 1776, which Lenin called one of the really liberating, really revolutionary wars, began the history of the modern capitalist United States. It was fought by a coalition of merchants, planters, small farmers, and white and Negro toilers. It was led chiefly by the merchant capitalists, with the democratic masses doing the decisive fighting. The revolution, by establishing American national independence, shattered the restrictions placed upon the colonial productive forces by England. It freed the national market and opened the way for a speedy growth of trade and industry. It at least partially broke down the feudal system of land tenure, and it brought limited political rights to the small farmers and also to the workers, who were mostly artisans, but it did not destroy Negro chattel slavery. And for the embattled Indian peoples, the revolution produced only a still more vigorous effort to strip them of their lands and to destroy them. The revolution also had far-reaching international repercussions. It helped inspire the people of France to get rid of their feudal tyrants. It stimulated the peoples of Latin America to free themselves from the yoke of Spain and Portugal, and it was an energizing force in the world wherever the bourgeoisie, supported by the democratic masses, were fighting against feudalism. The revolution was helped to success by the assistance given the rebelling colonies by France, Spain, and Holland, as well as by revolutionary struggles taking place currently in Ireland and England. The revolution was fought under the broad generalizations of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, which called for national independence and freedom for all men. It declared the right of revolution and the dominance of the secular over the religious in government. But these principles meant very different things to the several classes that carried through the revolution. To the merchants, they signified their rise to dominant power and an unrestricted opportunity to exploit the rest of the population. To the planters, they implied the continuation and extension of their slave system. To the farmers, they meant free access to the broad public lands. To the workers, they promised universal suffrage, more democratic liberties, and a greater share in the wealth of the new land. And to the oppressed Negroes, they brought a new hope of freedom from the misery and sufferings of chattel bondage. The Constitution, as originally formulated in 1787, and as adopted in the face of powerful opposition, consisted primarily of the rules and relationships agreed upon by the ruling class for the management of the society which they controlled. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, providing for freedom of speech, press, and assembly, religious liberty, trial by jury, and other popular democratic liberties, was written into the Constitution in 1791 under heavy mass pressure. Great as were the accomplishments of the Revolution, it nevertheless left unsolved many bourgeois democratic tasks. These unfinished tasks constituted a serious hindrance to the nation's fullest development. The struggle to solve these questions in a progressive direction made up the main content of United States history for the next 3/4 of a century. Among the more basic of these tasks were the abolition of slavery, the opening up of the broad western lands to settlement, and the deepening and extension of the democratic rights of the people. The main post-revolutionary fight of the toiling masses, in the face of fierce reactionary opposition, was aimed chiefly at preserving and extending their democratic rights won in the revolution. It was a great post-revolutionary political rally of these democratic forces that brought Jefferson to the presidency in 1800. Coming to power on a program of wresting the government from the hands of the privileged few, Jefferson sought to create a democracy based primarily upon the small farmers, but excluding the Negroes. From this fact, many have drawn the erroneous conclusion that his policies were a brake on American industrial development. Actually, however, by the abolition of slavery in the North, the opening up of public lands, the battle against British dumping in America, and the extension of the popular franchise, all during Jefferson's period, the growth of the country's economy was greatly facilitated. The extraordinary rapidity of the United States' economic advance in the decades following the Victorious Revolution was to be ascribed to a combination of several favorable factors, including the presence of vast natural resources, the relative absence of feudal economic and political remnants, the shortage of labor power, the constant flow of immigrants, and the tremendous extent of territory under one government. Another, most decisive factor was the immense stretch of new land awaiting capitalist development, the opening up of which played a vital part for decades in the economic and political growth of the country. It absorbed a vast amount of capital, it largely shaped the workers' ideology and also the progress and forms of the labor movement, and it was a main bone of contention between the rival, struggling classes of industrialists and planters. As Lenin, a close student of American agriculture, noted, that peculiar feature of the United States, the availability of unoccupied free land, explains the extremely wide and rapid development of capitalism in the United States. The beginnings of the trade union movement. The swiftness of the industrial growth of the United States was matched by that of the working class. In pre-revolutionary days, the stable part of the free working class was largely made up of skilled craftsmen, shipbuilders, building mechanics, tailors, shoemakers, bakers, and so on, who inherited much of the European guild system, with its relations of masters and journeymen. The shift of the center of production from home to mill, however, and the development of the factory system, especially after the War of 1812, revolutionized the status of American labor. The development of the national market enabled the budding capitalists, with their expanding factories and large crews of workers, soon to replace the master craftsmen employing only a few mechanics at the bench. The new capitalists resorted to the most ruthless exploitation of the workers, which included huge numbers of women and children, and they displaced skilled labor by machinery. The conditions of the workers in this period were abominable. The hours of labor extended from sun up to sundown, 13 to 16 hours per day. Wages were often no more than $1 a day for men, and far less for women and children. In the shops, the workers were subjected to the worst boss tyranny. Health conditions were unspeakable, and safety precautions totally absent. The workers also had no protection whatever against the hazards of unemployment, accidents, sickness, and old age. When they could not pay their way, they were thrown into debtors' prisons. As late as 1833, there were 75,000 workers in these monstrous jails. Irish immigrants and free Negro workers were employed building turnpikes and canals, and they died like flies in the swamps. The workers were faced with the alternatives of going west, of submitting to the harsh conditions of this work, or of fighting back. Inasmuch as the great bulk could not afford the expense of going west and taking up land, they stood and fought the exploiters. Mostly their struggles, at first, were in the shape of blind, spontaneous strikes. But soon they learned, particularly the skilled workers, that in order to fight effectively they needed organization. The trade union movement began to take shape, and strikes multiplied. But the employers struck back viciously, using the Old English common law, which branded as conspiracies, all combinations, organizations, to improve wages and other conditions of work. Before the 1819 economic crisis, there were already many unions in various trades and cities. During that industrial crash, these early unions collapsed. But no sooner had industrial conditions begun to improve again when the workers, with ever greater energy and clearer understanding, resumed the building of their unions. The next decade saw very important strikes of the newborn labor movement. The unions, in this early period, began to extend into many new occupations and to combine into city-wide federations. By 1836, such union centers existed in 13 of the major seaboard cities. The unskilled were also being increasingly drawn into the movement. A high point in the rising labor movement was reached in 1833-37, when 173 strikes were recorded, chiefly for better wages and the shorter workday. During these years, in March 1834, the National Trades Union, the workers' first attempt at a general labor federation, was organized. It lasted 3 years. The Panic of 1837 again wiped out most of the trade unions, yet the great struggles of the 20s and 30s had produced lasting results. In addition to the 10-hour day gains, imprisonment for debt was abolished, a mechanics lien law passed, a common school system set up in the North, and property qualifications for voting as yet only by whites in the North were practically eliminated. Labor's first steps toward independent political action. The workers of young America, oppressed by ruthless exploiters, had been quick to learn the value of trade unionism, and the most advanced among them also saw early the necessity for political action on class lines. They realized that it was not enough that they had the voting franchise. They had to organize to use it effectively. Bourgeois historians have coined the theory that the American workers historically have resorted alternately to economic or political action, as they lost faith in one form and turned to the other. The facts show, however, as indicated by these early American experiences, that the same working-class upsurge that produced great economic struggles also found its expression in various forms of political activity. Thus, the city of Philadelphia, the first to build a labor union, to organize a central labor body, and to call a general strike, was also the starting place for the first labor party in the United States. The call for a political party issued by the Philadelphia labor unions in 1828 declared that the mechanics and working men of the city and county of Philadelphia are determined to take the management of their own interests, as a class, in their own immediate keeping. The New York Workingmen's Party was launched a year later, and during the years 1828 to 34, some 61 local labor parties were established, with 50 labor newspapers. These local parties, despite ferocious attacks from the employers, made many gains such as the 10-hour day on public works, the free public schools, and limitations on the labor of women and children. The workers dovetailed this political struggle with the economic battles of the trade unions. But within a few years the local parties had passed out of existence. Although these local labor parties did not develop into a permanent national organization, they nevertheless prepared the ground for the next phase of the political struggles on a national scale. The Farmer Labor Alliance that formed around Andrew Jackson during the 1830s. Labor, although still weak, was particularly attracted to support Jackson, the frontiersman president, because of his vigorous attacks upon the United States Bank, the darling project of the budding capitalists of the time. This movement in support of Jackson was the beginning of labor's organized functioning in the support of bourgeois political parties, a pole which was to become of decisive importance in later decades. The disappearance of the early Labor Party movement was to be ascribed to various reasons. The local parties were torn by internal dissension, cultivated by outside politicians, who sought either to lead them back to the bourgeois parties or else to destroy them. They were undermined also by political confusion, engendered by various schemes and panaceas of utopian reformers. They were subjected, too, to extreme attacks from the reactionaries on moral and religious grounds. Besides, the major bourgeois parties, largely for purposes of demagogy, took over much of their program. Underlying all these weaknesses, however, was the basic fact that the continued existence of the frontier made possible the persistence of Jeffersonian illusions and prejudices which prevented the development of a stable working class and the establishment of an independent class political movement. Ideology of the early labor movement. The American labor movement entered the industrial era with a Jeffersonian ideology inherited from the agrarian and colonial past. The mass of workers who took part in the struggles of the 1820s and 30s of the immature working class could not and did not raise the question of the overthrow of the existing social order. Their fight, instead, was directed toward realizing the promises of 1776, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. They held tenaciously to the concept of a government representing the interests of all the people. They saw the solution of their problems, not in changing the existing order, but in improving and democratizing it. The workers predominantly held the Jeffersonian theory of democracy. This was largely the adaptation to American conditions of John Locke's conceptions of natural rights and equalitarianism. These ideas, seized upon by the revolutionary bourgeoisie in its struggle against feudalism, had become the dominant ideology of the revolution and as such were absorbed by the workers. The great influence of the Declaration of Independence upon working-class thinking during the pre-Civil War decades was evidenced by the repetition of its language and form in many Union constitutions and statements. But the bitter capitalist exploitation soon began to give a different class content to the outlook of the working class. The workers' demand for equality was no longer limited to formal equality at the ballot box. It was also directed against economic inequality and exploitation. Crude but penetrating attacks upon the capitalist system began to be formulated in proletarian circles. "We are prepared to maintain," said the Mechanics' Free Press of Philadelphia, "that all who toil have a natural and inalienable right to reap the fruits of their own industry, and that they who labor are the authors of every comfort, convenience, and luxury." The Workingmen's Political Association of Penn Township, Pennsylvania, declared that there appears to exist two distinct classes, rich and poor, the oppressors and the oppressed, those that live by their own labor and those that live by the labor of others. The Workingmen's Advocate of New York demanded a revolution which would leave behind it no trace of the government responsible for the workers' hardships, and Thomas Skidmore, one of the most famous radicals of the times, proposed a cooperative society which would compel all men, without exception, to labor as much as others must labor for the same amount of enjoyment, or in default thereof, to be deprived of such enjoyment altogether. The land reform theory of George Henry Evans fell under this general head. Many poets and writers, Thoreau, Whittier, Emerson, and others, expressed similar radical ideas. These anti-capitalist expressions represented a groping of the masses for a program of working-class emancipation. But they lacked a scientific foundation and a firm set of working principles. It was the historical role of Marxism to give the needed clarity and purpose to this early proletarian theoretical revolt and to raise it to the level of scientific socialism. Utopian socialism. The crisis of 1837, and the 12 long years of depression that followed it, profoundly influenced the thinking of labor and the progressive intellectuals. In their search for a way out of the bitter evils which encompassed them, many advanced beyond the limits of capitalism proper. In the face of the reduced standards of the workers, the sufferings of the unemployed, and the general paralysis of industry, they concluded that what was needed was a new social system which would end the exploitation and oppression of the many by the few. Lacking a scientific analysis of the laws of capitalist society, however, they had no recourse but to devise or support various ingeniously concocted plans for new social orders. Thus was initiated an era of utopian experiments. While these utopian schemes originated mainly in Europe, they were most extensively developed in the United States. At least 200 such projects were undertaken within a few years. American soil was particularly inviting for them. There was ample land to be had cheaply, the people were burdened with few feudal political restrictions, and the masses, near inexperienced to the Great Revolution, were readily inclined to try social change and experimentation. Indeed, America, long before this time, had already had considerable experience with cooperative regimes. The Indian tribes all over the Western Hemisphere had been organized on a primitive communal basis. Also the colonies in both Virginia and Massachusetts, during their early critical years, practiced some sharing in common of the general production. And from 1776 on numerous European religious societies, on a primitive communal basis, Shakers, Rabbits, Zorrites, Ebenezers, Bethelites, Perfectionists, etc., took root in the United States and expanded widely. But the three utopian schemes most important in the pre-Civil War era were those of Robert Owen, a Scotsman, and Charles Fourier and Étienne Cabot, both Frenchmen, registered. Owen, a humanitarian industrialist, planning to found a society in which all the workers would own the means of production and where there would be no exploitation, came to the United States in 1824 and established cooperative colonies in New Harmony, Indiana, and also in a few other places. At first these enterprises attracted wide attention, but by 1828 they had all perished. Owen was invited to speak to Congress. In 1845 he called an international socialist convention in New York, but it amounted to very little. The Fourierist utopians made even more of a stir than the Owenites. Differing from Owen, who abolished private property rights, Fourier preserved individual ownership. Unlike Owen also, Fourier considered industry an unmitigated evil and relied upon an agrarian, handicraft economy. The Fourierists, with the support of such prominent figures as Albert Brisbane, Horace Greeley, James Russell Lowell, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Margaret Fuller, and Henry Thoreau, during the 1840s set up some 40 phalanxes or colonies. The most famous of these was Brook Farm, near Boston. By 1850, however, the movement had virtually disappeared. The Cabot, or Icarian movement established its first agrarian colony in Texas, in 1848. Various others were soon set up in Missouri and Iowa. Some of these cooperative ventures lingered on in skeleton form until as late as the 1890s. During this same general period Wilhelm Weitling, a German immigrant worker, tried, with but little success, to establish a utopian conceived labor exchange bank, from which the workers would receive certificates to the full value of their product. It was Weitling's idea that this scheme would gradually replace capitalist production, but it soon went the way of all such enterprises. In the 1840s and 1850s a big movement also developed toward producers and consumers cooperatives, which the numerous utopians advanced as a social cure-all. Many of the great crop of land reformers of the period were also filled with grandiose conceptions of fundamental social change, largely of a utopian character. Even as late as the 1800s traces of this agrarian utopianism were still to be observed, as for example, in the Debs colonization schemes, see page 94. The many utopian colonies and movements which sprang up in the pre-Civil War period eventually died out because they were not based upon the realities of material conditions or upon an understanding of society and its laws of growth and decay. They were constructed according to arbitrary plans, emanating from wishful thinking. These little island colonies were artificial creations and could not survive in the midst of the broad capitalist sea, which inevitably engulfed them one and all. They proved, among other things, that it is impossible to build a new society within the shell of the old. The more definitely utopian schemes, with the exception of Weitling's, never greatly attracted the workers, who turned to more practical projects, such as trade unionism and political action. They were mostly anti-slavery, but they had few Negro members. The supporters of the various utopias consisted chiefly of white farmers and city middle-class elements. The great European utopian leaders, with their artificially constructed social regimes and ignorance of the leading role of the workers, could not lay the foundations of a solid socialist movement. Nevertheless, they performed a very useful service for the workers by their sharp condemnations of capitalist exploitation. As Marx and Engels pointed out, they were definitely the forerunners of scientific socialism. And as Engels said, German theoretical socialism will never forget that it rests upon the shoulders of St. Simon, Fourier, and Owen, the three who, in spite of their fantastic notions in utopianism, belonged to the most significant heads of all time, and whose genius anticipated numerous things, the correctness of which can now be proved in a scientific way. This, briefly, was the course of the class struggle in this country before the rise of Marxism. The workers were with increasing vigor combating their exploiters economically, politically, and ideologically, but in this fight, because of the youth of capitalism, the working class still lacked the class consciousness, energizing force, and clear direction, which finally was to manifest itself in the Communist Party. 2. Pioneer Marxists in the United States, 1848 to 1860. The foundation of scientific socialism dates from the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848 by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. These two great scientists were the first to explain that socialism, contrary to the ideas of the utopians, was not the invention of dreamers, but the inevitable outcome of the workings of modern capitalist society. They discovered the laws of capitalist development and proved that the growth of capitalist society, with the class struggle going on within it, must inevitably lead to the downfall of capitalism, to the victory of the working class, to the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism. They taught that the proletariat was the gravedigger of capitalism and that its victory would rid humanity of all exploitation. The doctrines of scientific socialism were introduced into the United States during the decade preceding the Civil War. The objective conditions had become ripe for them. Industry was growing rapidly, and despite the restrictive power of the slavocracy, American capitalism had already reached fourth place among the industrial nations of the world. During this decade, the volume of manufactured goods doubled, railroad mileage increased from 9,000 to 31,000, annual coal production, 50,000 tons in the 1830s, reached 14 million in 1850, and a tremendous advance took place in the concentration and centralization of capital. The discovery of gold in California had given a big stimulus to general capitalist development. The working class had also become numerically stronger, and class relations were sharpening. Immigrants, mostly skilled workers and farmhands, were pouring into the country at double the rate of the preceding decade, and already about one-third of the population was depending upon manufacturing for its livelihood. During these early decades, revolutionary socialists called themselves communists. As Marx pointed out, this was because the utopians and opportunists had discredited the name of socialist. During the period of the Second International, however, from 1889 to 1914, when opportunists and revolutionaries found themselves within one organization, the terms socialist and social democrat again came into general use. After the Russian Revolution, for the same reasons that had originally moved Marx to adopt the term communist, the Bolsheviks ceased calling themselves social democrats and resumed the designation of communists. The name communist is also more accurate scientifically. Marxism took root in the United States after the working class had already experienced two deep economic crises. The workers had long undergone severe exploitation at the hands of the employers. They had built many trade unions and local labor parties, waged innumerable hard-fought strikes and political campaigns, and won various important concessions in sharp class struggle. As we have seen, the most developed thinkers among them had already begun to attack the capitalist system as such and to seek a way of escape from its evils. The acceptance of Marxist socialism by these advanced sections of the working class was, therefore, the logical climax of the whole course of social development in the United States since the Revolutionary War. It was further stimulated by the current revolutionary events in Europe, the Chartist movement in England and the revolutionary struggles in France, Germany, and Ireland, with all of which the awakening American working class felt a vivid and direct kinship. The traditional charge by employers that Marxist socialism, because it originated in Europe, is therefore alien to the United States, is typically stupid. As well assert the same of the alphabet, the multiplication table, the law of gravity, and a host of other scientific principles and discoveries, all of which also developed outside of the United States. Marxism is no more alien to the United States because of the historically conditioned German origin of its founders, or the Russian origin of Lenin and Stalin, than is the American Declaration of Independence because of the British origin of John Locke, and the French origin of the encyclopedists. German Marxist immigrants. Marxist thought, based on the generalized experiences of the toiling masses of all countries and worked into a science on European soil, was transmitted to the American working class by the stream of political immigrants, mainly German, who came to this country following the defeat of the European revolutions of 1848. During the 1830s about 2,000 German immigrants arrived yearly, but after 1848 this stream became a torrent of over 200,000 annually throughout the 1850s. There were also large numbers of Irish immigrants, and Italian and French as well, the latter particularly after the Franco-Prussian War and the defeat of the Commune in 1871. But it was the Germans who remained the most decisive force in developing Marxist thought in the United States throughout most of the rest of the 19th century. They were the earliest forerunners of the modern Communist Party. The Germans settled chiefly in such main industrial centers as New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati. Many entered industry as skilled mechanics and soon began to exert a strong influence on the development of the trade union movement. While most of them considered themselves socialists and revolutionaries, they brought along with them a wide variety of political ideas, and they reflected the many ideological divisions that existed in their homeland. Their primary preoccupation was with events in the old country, but many of the Germans, in the early 1840s, began to be drawn into American political affairs. In 1845, a group of Germans formed the Social Reform Association as part of the National Reform Association. The principal figure in this movement was Hermann Kriege, once a co-worker with Marx, who later swallowed the doctrines of George Henry Evans, a labor editor who had become a land reformer. Kriege was probably the first radical exponent of American exceptionalism. In substance, he was already generating the notion that there existed in the United States a capitalist system fundamentally different from that of Europe, and he developed the theory that because of the great mass of free land, the American workers need not follow the revolutionary course of their European brothers. He declared that if the 1,400,000,000 acres of United States lands were distributed to the poor, an end will be put to poverty in America at one stroke. Marx castigated Kriege for this opportunism and riddled his agrarian illusions. Another important figure among the early circles of German immigrant workers was Wilhelm Weitling. After an earlier visit, he returned to the United States in 1849. Weitling was one of the first revolutionary leaders to come from the ranks of the workers. He took a position midway between utopian and scientific socialism. His plan for a labor exchange bank, previously indicated, attracted much working-class support, and for the next decade it proved to be a confusing element in the developing Marxist movement. Weidmeyer, pioneer of American socialism. Joseph Weidemeyer, born in Germany, an artillery officer who had participated in the Revolution of 1848, was the best-informed Marxist early to immigrate to the United States. More than any other, he contributed toward laying the foundations of scientific socialism in the New World. Arriving in 1851, Weidemeyer stood out as the leader among the American Marxists, which then included such men as F. A. Sorge, Adolf Douay, August Willich, Robert Rosa, Fritz Jacobi, and Siegfried Meyer, most of whom had known and worked with Marx personally in Germany. Sorge, like Weidemeyer, was a well-developed Marxist. Marx and Engels long carried on a voluminous correspondence with him. Weidemeyer and his co-Marxists found the socialist movement in the United States in confusion. There were the disintegrating effects of Weitling's labor exchange bank scheme. Kriege was advocating his agrarian panacea. Willich and Gottfried Kinkel were seeking to transform the movement simply into a campaign to advance the revolution in Germany. And there were various groups of utopians and anarchists. Of all the groupings, only the German Sports Society, the Turnverein, organized in 1850, had a relatively sound program. Founded upon advanced socialist ideas, this body opposed conspiratorial groups and proposed instead a broad democratic movement rooted among the masses. While these Marxists supported the Free Soil and other reform movements, they warned that these were not the path to socialism, and they emphasized that the emancipation of the working class could only be achieved in struggle led by the proletariat against the capitalist class. Weidemeyer, a close co-worker of Marx and Engels and well-grounded in Marxist theory, was singularly qualified to undertake the task of clarifying the ideology of the budding American socialist movement. He was an extremely capable and energetic organizer, and he had spent 3 years in underground work in Germany, where in the face of the fierce Prussian terror, he had continued to spread the works of Marx and Engels. A gifted polemist, Weidemeyer ably defended Marxism against many distortions. He possessed the ability to apply Marxist principles to American conditions. He avoided the errors of the utopians, of the radical agrarians, and also those of the exceptionalists, who believed that the workings of American bourgeois democracy on the land question would solve the problems of the working class. Marx considered Weidemeyer as one of our best men, and had agreed to his going to the United States only because of the growing importance of America in the world labor movement. The Proletarian League. The Proletarian League, founded in New York in June 1852, was the first definitely Marxist organization on American soil. It was composed of 17 of the most advanced Marxists in New York City, at the initiative of Weidemeyer and Sorge. The rising tide of labor struggle won. See Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, Letters to Americans, N. Y. 1952. And organization, and the rapidly developing strike movement in the United States, together with the foundation by Marx of the German Workers' Society in Europe, gave the immediate impetus to the formation of the pioneer Proletarian League. In starting the League, and in the ensuing work of that organization, the Marxists, then called Communists, based themselves upon the newly published Communist Manifesto. This historic document, which still serves as a guide for the world's socialist movement, furnished a clear and basic program for the young and still very weak American movement. Marx and Engels, who always paid very close attention to developments in the United States, were prompt in seeing to it that copies of the Great Manifesto were sent to Weidemeyer and his co-workers. The Communist Manifesto, among its many fundamental political lessons, teaches that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself, that every class struggle is a political struggle, that the building of a political party of the most advanced section of the workers is fundamental to the success of the socialist movement, that the proletariat, in its struggles, must make alliances with other progressive forces in society, that the Marxists have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole, that communists must fight for the immediate as well as the ultimate interests of the working class, and that socialism can be established only through the abolition of the capitalist system. Die Revolution, the first American Marxist paper, founded in 1852 and edited by Wedemeyer, popularized this basic program. In the first of the only 2 issues of the paper there appeared, years before it was published in Europe, Marx's classic historical work, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. During the following year, this original Marxist journal was succeeded by another, Die Reform, also with Wedemeyer as its guiding spirit. This paper, finally a daily, became the leading labor journal in the United States. As consistent Marxists, the League members did not live in an ivory tower. Together with centering major attention upon theoretical clarification, they also, in the spirit of the Communist Manifesto, participated actively in the struggles of the working class. In all this work, Sorge played a role second only to that of Wedemeyer, and thenceforth, for over a generation, he was to be a tower of strength in the political movements of the American working class. The Marxists, small though they were in number, issued in March 1853 a call through the trade unions of German-speaking workers for the formation of one large workers' union. Consequently, over 800 workers gathered in Mechanics Hall, New York, and launched the American Labor Union. The platform of this organization, avoiding the utopianism of Weitling and the ultra-revolutionary fantasies of Willich and Kinkel, adopted a short program of immediate demands. This first American Marxist program of immediate demands had the weakness of not being specific and also of ignoring the basic issue of slavery. The organization was composed almost exclusively of German workers. It was a sort of labor party, with affiliated trade unions and ward branches. Its lifespan was short. While stressing the united political action of all workers, the American Labor Union directed its energies to the organization of new workers in each craft. Its program called for the immediate naturalization of all immigrants, passage of federal labor laws, removal of burdensome taxes, and the limitation of the working day to 10 hours. It gave active support to the many strikes of the period. And upon its initiative, representatives of 40 trades with 2,000 members launched the General Trade Union of New York City. The impact of these movements made itself felt among the English-speaking workers in other cities. Through the efforts of 2 leading Marxists, Sam Briggs and Adolph Kluss, the Workingmen's National Association was set up in the city of Washington in April 1853. The organization, however, died during the same year. The American Labor Union was reorganized in 1857 as the General Workers' League, but it, too, died out by 1860.1. Formation of the Communist Club. The severe economic crisis that struck the country in the autumn of 1857 sharply changed the character of the workers' struggles. Although it hit the native workers hard, causing them much suffering, the ease alley of the pie where can't pay the pecan V's in. The forefront BF these cités stood cis avsists a though few in number, were able to give the workers clear-sighted and militant leadership. Big demonstrations of the unemployed, led by the communists, took place in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Newark, and elsewhere. They demanded relief and denounced the ruling class and its system that created starvation amid plenty. So outstanding was the role of the Marxists in this period that all important struggles of the time were labeled communist revolts and attempts at revolution. To better coordinate their activities, the Marxists reorganized their forces, forming the Communist Club in New York on October 25, 1858. Friedrich Kamm was elected chairman, and Fritz Faceby secretary. Al. Club Resolution proclaimed equals as the aims of the communists. We recognize no distinction as to nationality or race, caste or status, color or sex. Our goal is but reconciliation of all human interests, freedom, and happiness for mankind, and the realization and unification of a world republic. The Communist Club of New York, exercising national leadership, began to establish communication, with similar but smaller groups springing up in other major centers, notably Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati. With many leading Marxists in hiding, Wedemeyer, who had moved to the Middle West. The center of the movement Alcee soon shifted to Chicago, where the #Arbiter, Veritan, Workers' Club, was coming forward as the most effective socialist organization of the period. Developments abroad and the growing movement for international solidarity occupied much of the attention of the Marxists in the United States. Key _formation _of _ and _ international _ committee _ in London in 1856, to Convolution, stimulated, these trends and American Central Committee of the International Association was set up, with contacts in many cities. One of its first and most successful undertakings was a mass meeting to commemorate the historic June days of the 1848 Revolution in France. Another event, in April 1858, was a big torchlight parade in honor of Felice Orsini, the Italian patriot who had attempted the assassination of Napoleon III. All of these activities brought the German Marxists into contact with other working-class forces, and consequently helped to prepare the groundwork for the International Workingmen's Association, founded in 1864 and later known as the First International. Laying the theoretical foundations of the United States. The early Marxists were confronted with the task of developing the ideological, tactical, and organizational basis for Marxism in America. As yet, however, this movement was not united ideologically, nor was it organized into a national party. This meant that first of all the Marxists themselves had to master the teachings of Marx and Engels. This implied, furthermore, acquiring the ability to apply the principles of Marxism to the specific conditions in this country. They also had to lay the foundations of a national Marxist political party. All this called for the most persistent struggle to free the minds of the workers from the many Jeffersonian, bourgeois agrarian illusions which persisted with particular stubbornness among them. The needs for ideological clarification and political organization were freshly stressed when, with the easing of the economic crisis of 1857, various petty bourgeois conceptions began to make themselves increasingly felt afresh in the thinking of the workers. These were also reflected in growing confusion and friction in the Marxist movement. Thus, some of the leaders did not push the fight against slavery, although claiming to be true disciples of Marx. Also various utopian sects reappeared, and Weiteling's harmful notions sprang up again in new garb. In undertaking their great tasks of ideological and organizational development, the early Marxists were favored by the fact that in the decade before the Civil War many of the fundamental problems of Marxist theory, its philosophy, political economy, and revolutionary tactics, had been developed by Marx and Engels. In addition to the famous Manifesto, they had also completed such basic works as Wage Labor and Capital, Ludwig Feuerbach, the 18th Brumaire, and the Peasant War in Germany. The American movement also had the tremendous advantage of close personal contact with Marx and Engels, who both carefully observed and advised on its development. The great problem of the Marxists in the United States, of course, was to apply Marxist principles to specific American conditions. Here the early Marxists were faced with many objective and subjective difficulties. These difficulties, in their essence, continued constantly to reappear in new forms and under new conditions, and they have persisted in many ways down to the present day. Already in the 1850s the Marxists noticed a seeming contradiction between the great militancy and fighting capacity of the American working class, and the slowness with which the workers developed a class-conscious outlook toward politics and society. They noted the contradiction between the highly advanced development of American capitalism and the subjective backwardness of the labor movement. Some of the German immigrants tried to explain this on the basis of a supposed innate political inferiority of the American working class, while others concluded that Marxism had no validity in the new, democratic United States. Combating such illusions, the early Marxist leaders pointed out the destructive effects upon labor of slavery in the South. They pointed out further that the existence of the free land in the West, by absorbing masses from the East, hindered the development of class consciousness and of a stable working class, and that the current petty bourgeois Jeffersonian ideas among the workers stemmed from the revolution of which the bourgeoisie were the ideological leaders, and also from the whole history of the country. They also gave a Marxist explanation of the recurrent economic crises, which deeply perplexed the workers and the whole American people. So powerful were the current bourgeois illusions and disintegrating influences among the workers that Engels, in 1892, wrote as follows to Hermann Schluter. Up to 1848 one could only speak of the permanent native working class as an exception. The small beginnings of it in the cities in the East always had still the hope of becoming farmers or bourgeois. Asterisk. The pioneer Marxists, Weidemeier, Sorge, and the others, greatly aided by the many new books, articles, letters, and the personal advice of Marx and Engels, fought on two ideological fronts, against the lefts, who believed that political activity was futile and that socialism was to be brought about by conspiratorial action and by directing themselves exclusively to supporting revolutionary movements in Germany. And also against the rights, who toyed with agrarian panaceas, sought to tie the workers to corrupt bourgeois politicians, and denied the role of Marxism in the United States. The Marxists especially attacked the budding theories of American exceptionalism, advocated by those who, like Kriege, sought to liquidate Marxism by arguing that communism was to be achieved in the United States by a different route from that in Europe, through agrarian reform. Of great help in this struggle were the current writings of Marx and Engels. They pointed out that the establishment of a bourgeois democracy, such as existed in the United States, did not abolish but greatly intensified all the inherent contradictions, and that the forces making for the speedier development of American capitalism were also producing more clear-cut class divisions and sharpening all-class relations. They pointed out that the land of opportunity was also the classical land of economic crises, unemployment, and of the sharpest extremes between the wealth of the few and the poverty of the great masses. One of the difficulties peculiar to early Marxism was that its founders, nearly all German immigrants, were striving to introduce their socialist ideas into a labor movement speaking a different language and having a background and traditions which they little understood. Many of these immigrants also thought that their own stay in America was only temporary, until victory was won in Germany. These circumstances provided fertile ground for sectarian tendencies, which manifested themselves in strong trends among the socialist-minded German workers to stay apart by themselves and to consider the American workers as politically immature. This sectarianism was a very serious obstacle to the bringing of socialist ideas to the masses of native workers, and for a full generation Engels thundered against it. The early Marxists carried on a great deal of propaganda on the need of the workers to act politically in their own interests. They stressed the importance of the workers fighting the employers on all levels. They exposed the fallacy of separating the political from the economic struggles. They showed that every economic struggle, such as the 10-hour day fight, when the working class fought as a class against the ruling class, was a political struggle. The developed Marxists of the decade just prior to the Civil War were only a handful, yet, for all their weakness, they made tremendous contributions to the young American labor movement. They were pioneer builders of the trade unions. They fought in the front line of every struggle of the workers. They helped break down the barriers between native and immigrant workers. Along with native abolitionists, they were militant fighters against Negro slavery. They helped to build up a solid and influential labor press. And above all, they created the first corps of organized Marxists in America, and they spread far and wide the writings of Marx and Engels. The extent of the general influence of the pioneer Marxists may be gauged from the fact that many young trade unions of the period, in their preambles, used the Communist Manifesto as their guide. For all their relative sensitivity to the position of the white workers, the Negroes, the immigrants, and other oppressed sections of the population, the pioneer Marxists did not, however, become aware of the significance of the struggle of the Indian tribes, who during these years were being viciously robbed and butchered by the ruthless white invaders of their lands. Indeed, in the whole period from Jefferson right down to our own day, the long series of workers' trade unions and political parties have almost completely ignored the plight and sufferings of the abused and heroic Indian peoples. The story of labor's relations with the Indians is practically a blank. 3. The Marxists in the struggle against slavery. 1848 to 1865. The United States Constitution, drawn up after the Revolutionary War and implying the continuation of Negro slavery, was a compromise between the rival classes of Southern planters and Northern merchants and industrialists. But it established no stability between these classes, and they were soon thereafter at each other's throats. The plantation system and slavery spread rapidly in the South after the invention of the 1795. In the North, the power of the industrialists grew rapidly with cotton gin in 1793 and the development of sugarcane production in the expansion of the factory system and the settlement of the West. The interests of the two systems were incompatible and the clash between them sharpened continuously. Developing relentlessly over the basic, related questions of control of the newly organized territories and of the federal government, this struggle was finally to culminate in the Great Second Revolution of 1861-65. As the vast new territories acquired by the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, by the seizure of Florida in 1819, and by the Oregon Accession in the Mexican War of 1846, were carved up into states and brought into the Union, the bitter political rivals grabbed them off alternately as free or slave states. Thus, a very precarious balance was maintained. The Northern industrialists vigorously opposed the extensive infiltration of the slave system into the West and Southwest, even threatening secession from the Union. They contested the Louisiana Purchase, and bitterly condemned the unjust Mexican War, in which the United States took half of Mexico's territory, the present states of Texas, California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, and part of Wyoming. Lincoln denounced this predatory war, and opposition to it was intense in the young labor movement. On the other hand, the industrialists were eager to seize Oregon, and they never ceased plotting against the territorial integrity of Canada, as these were non-slavery areas. Despite all its expansion, the slave system, however, could not possibly keep pace in strength with the great strides of industry in the North. By 1860, 75% of the nation's production was in the North, and the same area also held $11 billion of the national wealth as against $5 billion held by the South. To redress the balance of power shifting rapidly against them, the Southern planters embarked upon a militant offensive to consolidate their own power. In the face of this drive, the Northern industrialists at first retreated. Their ranks were split, as many bankers, shippers, and textile manufacturers were tied up economically with the South. They were confused as to how to handle the complex slavery issue, and they feared the growing power of the working class. During the 1850s, the planters, through the Democratic Party, controlled both houses of Congress, the presidency, and 7 of the 9 Supreme Court judges. They used their power with arrogance. They passed the Fugitive Slave Act, repealed the Missouri Compromise by adopting the pro-slavery Kansas-Nebraska Act, slashed the tariff laws, adopted the infamous Dred Scott decision, vetoed the Homestead Bill, and declared slavery to be legal in all the territories. Marx raised the real issue when he spoke of the fact that 20 million free men in the North were being subordinated to 300,000 Southern slaveholders. Class tensions mounted and the country moved relentlessly toward the Great Civil War. The abolitionist movement. It was the leaders and fighters of the abolitionist movement, in their relentless opposition to slavery, who most fully expressed the historic interests of the as yet hesitant bourgeoisie and of the whole people. Men and women like Frederick Douglass, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, John Brown, and Elijah P. Lovejoy prodded and stirred the conscience of the nation. They fought to destroy slavery, built the Underground Railway, and aggressively combated the fugitive slave laws. With few exceptions, they based their fight for Negro emancipation mainly upon ethical and humanitarian grounds. The most powerful force fighting for abolition, however, was the 4 million Negro slaves in the South. For generations, and especially since the turn of the century, the recurring slave revolts, violent protests against the horrible conditions of slavery, shook the very foundations of the slavocracy. Despite the most ferocious suppression, the Negroes sabotaged the fieldwork, burned plantations, killed planters, and organized many insurrections. These struggles grew more intense as the Civil War approached. The South became a veritable armed camp, with one Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, The Civil War in the United States, p. 71, n. y. 1937. The planters making desperate efforts to stamp out the growing revolt of their slaves. Imperishable are the names of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and the many other brave Negro fighters in this heroic struggle for liberty. The Northern white workers also played a vital part in the great struggle. The existence of slavery in the South was a drag on these workers' living conditions and the growth of their trade unions in the North. Marx made this basic fact clear in his famous statement that labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin when in the black it is branded. Retarding factors to the Northern workers' understanding of the slavery issue, however, were the anti-labor union tendencies among middle-class abolitionists and the pressure in the workers' ranks of opportunist leaders. Such men as George Henry Evans, the land reformer, for example, argued that the emancipation of the slaves prior to the abolition of wage slavery would be contrary to the interests of the workers, as it would confront the latter with the competition of a great mass of cheap labor. Once organized labor sensed, however, that the abolition of slavery was the precondition for its own further advance. It was ready to join in the great immediate task of destroying the bloc that stood in the path of its development and that of the nation. With this realization, during the late 1850s, labor became the inveterate enemy of slavery, and it became a foundation force in the great coalition of capitalists, workers, Negroes, and farmers that carried through and won the Civil War. The role of the Marxists. From the beginning, under the general advice of Karl Marx, the Marxists in the United States took the most consistent and clear-sighted position within the labor movement in fighting for the outright abolition of slavery. The strong leadership of the present-day Communist Party among the Negro people has deep roots in the fight of these Marxist pioneers. They saw in the defeat of the slavocracy the precondition for consolidating the nation's productive forces, for the expansion of democracy, and for the creation of a numerous, independent, and homogeneous proletariat advancing its own interests. They also saw in the emancipation of the Negroes a great cause of human freedom. They realized that in order to clear the decks for the next historic advance, the working class must join with other anti-slavery forces and do its utmost in carrying through the immediate, democratic, revolutionary task of ending slavery and the slave system. The contribution of the early Marxists to the abolitionist movement was out of all proportion to their small numbers. They were very active in the terror-ridden South. Outstanding here was the work of Adolphe Douay, who had been a close co-worker of Karl Marx in Europe. In 1852, Douay settled in Texas where, at the time, it was said that 1/5 of the white population was made up of 48 feeders from Europe. In San Antonio, Douay published an abolitionist paper until he was finally compelled to leave in peril of his life. Important work was also done in Alabama under the leadership of the immigrant Marxist, Herman Meyer, who was likewise forced to flee. In the North, the anti-slavery Marxists were particularly active, notably the Communist Club of Cleveland. A conference in 1851 declared in favor of using all means which were adapted to abolishing slavery, an institution which they called repugnant to the principles of true democracy. In St. Louis and other centers where the German immigrants were numerous, the Marxists carried on intense anti-slavery activities. They developed these activities especially after the passage in 1854 of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which broke down the barriers against slavery in the Middle West. A few days after this bill reached Congress, the Chicago Socialists, led by George Schneider, a veteran of 1848 in Germany and editor of the Illinois State Gazette, initiated a campaign which culminated in a large public demonstration. On October 16, 1859, the heroic abolitionist, John Brown, and his 21 followers, Negroes and whites, electrified the country by seizing Harper's Ferry in a desperate but ill-fated attempt to develop an armed rising of the Negro slaves of the South. The Marxists hailed Brown's courageous action, and they organized supporting mass meetings in numerous cities. The Cincinnati Social Workingmen's Association, led by socialists, declared that the act of John Brown has powerfully contributed to bringing out the hidden conscience of the majority of the people. 10 of Brown's men were killed in the struggle, and he himself was later hanged. Joseph Weidemeyer, the Marxist leader, considered that all these developments signalized the beginnings of a new political awakening of the American labor movement. Along with Marx, however, he had to combat the sectarian views, held by Weitling, Kriege, and others, that Marxists should limit themselves to questions of the conditions of the workers in the struggle against capital, and that labor should avoid one Cincinnati Communist, December 5, 1859. Contamination with political activities. Some sectarians even branded participation in the anti-slavery movement as a betrayal of the special interests of the working class. In all his activities, Weidemeyer contended for the position that the fight against slavery was central in the work of Marxists in that period. He strove to involve the trade unions in the great struggle. He showed that without a solution of the slavery question, no basic working class problem could be solved. He linked the workers' immediate demands with the fundamental issue of Negro emancipation. In this fight, the American Workers' League, under Marxist influence, played an important role in winning the workers and organized labor for the abolition struggle. Thus, in 1854, after the passage of the infamous Kansas-Nebraska Act, the League held a big mass meeting which declared that the German-American workers of New York have, do now, and shall, continue to protest most emphatically against both white and black slavery and brand as a traitor against the people and their welfare everyone who shall lend it his support. The maturing of the crisis. Following the Nebraska infamy of 1854, events moved rapidly toward the decisive struggle. The arrogant actions of the planters, who controlled the government, aroused and sharpened the opposition in the North and West. The old political parties began to disintegrate, and the Republican Party was formed in February 1854. Alvin E. Bovee, former Secretary-Treasurer of the National Industrial Congress and a prominent leader in New York labor circles, brought together at Ripon, Wisconsin, a group of liberals, reformers, farmers, and labor leaders, all of whom were disgusted with the policies of the Whig and Democratic parties. This group decided to forget previous political names and organizations, and to band together to oppose the extension of slavery. Their program also supported those who were fighting for free land. The response of the Northern industrialists to the new party was immediate and favorable. Most of them saw in it the instrument with which to wrest political control from the slave owners and to advance their own program: protective tariffs, subsidies to railroads, absorption of the national resources, national banking system, etc. The mercantile and banking interests, however, tied financially to the cotton interests of the slave owners in the South, largely condemned the new party. The initial response of the workers to the Republican Party was varied. While many broke their traditional ties with the Democratic Party, others hesitated to join the same party with the industrialists. Among the Northern and Western farmers, the new party, however, got wide acceptance from the outset. The Marxists, basing themselves on the Marxist teachings, the Communist Manifesto, of fighting with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way, unhesitatingly supported the Republican Party and called upon labor to do likewise. Die Soziale Republik, organ of the Chicago Arbeiterbund, then the foremost Marxist group in the country, stated this policy. Although the Marxists were firm advocates of full emancipation of the Negroes, they held that they could best advance the anti-slavery cause by uniting with other social groups upon the basis of the widely accepted program of opposition to the further extension of slavery. His tactic was, in fact, a transition to a later, more advanced revolutionary struggle. In the elections of 1856, the Republicans especially strove to win the support of the workers. The Marxists took a very active part in the campaign. For example, in February 1856, they helped to initiate a conference in Decatur, Illinois, of 25 newspaper editors, including the German-American press, to organize the Anti-Nebraska Act forces for participation in the election campaign. Abraham Lincoln was present at this gathering and he ardently supported the resolution which it passed. This resolution was also adopted at the 1856 Philadelphia Convention, which nominated John C. Fremont for president. Fremont polled 1,341,264 votes, or one-third of the total vote cast. In consequence, the Democratic Party was split, the Whig Party was practically destroyed, and the Republican Party emerged as a major party. The election of Abraham Lincoln. The election in 1860 was the hardest fought in the history of the United States up to that time. The Republican Party made an all-out and successful effort to win the decisive support of the great masses of farmers, workers, immigrants, and free Negroes, who were all part of the great new coalition under the leadership of the Northern bourgeoisie. Philip S. Foner states that, "It is not an exaggeration to say that the Republican Party fought its way to victory in the campaign of 1860 as the party of free labor." Lincoln was a very popular candidate among the toiling masses. He was known to be an enemy of slavery. His many pro-labor expressions had won him a wide following among the workers. His advocacy of the Homestead Bill had secured him backing among the farmers of the North and West, and his fight against bigoted native, know-nothing ISM, had entrenched him generally among the foreign-born. He faced three opposing presidential candidates, Stephen A. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, and John Bell, representing the three-way split in the Democratic Party, and all supporting slavery in one way or another. Lincoln stood on a platform of containing slavery to its existing areas. There was no candidate pledged for outright abolition. In the bitterly fought election, the Slavocrats, who also had many contacts and supporters in the North, denounced Lincoln with every slander that their fertile minds could concoct. The Redbaiters of the Times shouted against Black Republicanism and Red Republicanism. Pro-slavery employers and newspapers tried to intimidate the workers by threatening them with discharge, by menacing them with a prospect of economic crisis, and by warning them that Negro emancipation would create a flood of cheap labor which would ruin wage rates. At the same time, the reactionaries tried to split the young Republican Party by cultivating know-nothing, anti-foreign movements inside its ranks. The Marxists were very active in this vital election struggle. The clarity of their anti-slavery stand and their militant spirit made up for their still very small numbers. Their key positions in many trade unions enabled them to be a real factor in mobilizing the workers behind Lincoln's candidacy. To this end, they spared no effort, holding election meetings of workers in many parts of the North and East. Undoubtedly, the labor vote swung the election for Lincoln, and for this the Marxists were entitled to no small share of the credit. The Marxists were energetic in winning the decisive foreign-born masses to support Lincoln. In 1860, the foreign-born made up 47.62% of the population of New York, 50% of Chicago and Pittsburgh, and 59.66% of St. Louis, with other cities in proportion. The Germans, by far the largest immigrant group in the country, were a powerful force in Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. They heavily backed Enkel. Of their German-language newspapers, 69 were for Lincoln. The Marxists were especially effective in creating pro-Lincoln sentiment among the German-American masses. This was graphically demonstrated at the significant Deutsches Haus Conference held in Chicago in May 1860, 2 days before the opening of the nominating convention of the Republican Party. This national conference represented all sections of German-American life. The Marxists Weidemeyer and Douay, who led the working-class forces at the conference, were of decisive importance in shaping the meeting's action. Douay, selected as head of the Resolutions Committee, wrote for the conference a series of resolutions demanding that they be applied in a sense most hostile to slavery. These resolutions largely furnished the basis for the election platform of the Republican Party. The fierce campaign of 1860 concluded with the election of Lincoln. The final tabulation showed Lincoln, 1,857,710, Douglas, 1,291,574, Breckinridge, 850,082, Bell, 646,124. The Civil War. In the face of Lincoln's victory, the oligarchy of Southern planters acted like any other ruling class suffering a decisive Democratic defeat, by taking up arms to hold on to and extend their power at any cost. Acting swiftly and disregarding the will for peace of their people, 7 Southern states seceded, setting up the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. All of this was done before Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, while the planters stooge president, James Buchanan, was still in office. Eventually, the Confederacy contained 11 states. The seceders opened fire on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, thus beginning the war. The conquest aims of the rebellious South were boundless. What the slaveholders, therefore, call the South, said Marx, embraces more than 3/4 of the territory hitherto comprised by the Union. The Second American Revolution had passed from the constitutional stage into that of military action. The North, ill-prepared, met with indecision the swift offensive of the Southern planters. This weakness reflected the prevailing divisions in the ranks of the bourgeoisie. Among these were the copperhead bankers and merchants, who strove for a negotiated peace on the slaveocracy's terms. Then there were the radical Republicans, representative of the rising industrial capitalists, whose most revolutionary spokesman was Thaddeus Stevens, and who insisted upon a military offensive to crush the rebellion, with the freeing and arming of the slaves. And finally there was the vacillating middle class, largely represented by Lincoln's hesitant course. The leaders of the government sought evasive formulas, instead of taking energetic steps to win the war. Lincoln, ready for any compromise short of disunion, proclaimed the slogan, "Save the Union," at a time when the situation demanded clearly also the revolutionary slogan of full and complete emancipation of the slaves. Stevens, bolder and clearer-sighted, declared that the Constitution is now silent and only the laws of war obtain. On the question of the slaves, Stevens stated that those who now furnish the means of war but are the natural enemies of the slaveholders must be made our allies. This position was strongly supported by the Negro masses, whose leading spokesman, Frederick Douglass, declared, from the first, "I reproached the North that they fought the rebels with only one hand, when they might effectively strike with two, that they fought with their soft white hand, while they kept their black iron hand chained and helpless behind them, that they fought the effect, while they protected the cause, and that the Union cause would never prosper till the war assumed an anti-slavery attitude, and the Negro was enlisted on the loyal side." While Lincoln carried on his defensive leadership, the military fortunes of the North continued to sink. Events combined, however, to change the conduct of the war from an attempt to suppress the slave owners' rebellion into a revolutionary struggle to liquidate the slave power. These main forces were the increasing power of the northern bourgeoisie through the rapid growth of industry and the railroads, the lessons learned from the bitter defeats in the early part of the war, and the tremendous pressure exerted by the farmers, the Negro masses, and the white workers, especially the foreign-born, for an aggressive policy in the war. Hence, on September 22, 1862, after about 18 months of unsuccessful war, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, proclaiming that after January 1 persons held as slaves in areas in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. In August 1862, the enlistment of free Negroes into the armed forces had been authorized. Lincoln removed the sabotaging General McClellan in March 1862 from his post as head of the Union forces, and generally adopted a more aggressive policy. The liberation of the slaves, with its blow to the slave economy and the addition of almost 200,000 Negro soldiers to the northern armies, proved to be of decisive importance. From the beginning of 1863 the slave power was clearly doomed. But it took 2 more years of bitter warfare until the South admitted defeat, with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. At the cost of 500,000 soldiers dead and 1 million more permanently crippled, the reactionary planters had been driven from political power and their slaves freed. The Civil War constituted a bourgeois democratic revolution. The capitalists of the North broke the dominant political power of the big Southern landowners and seized power for themselves. The slave system, which had become economically a brake upon the development of capitalism, was shattered. 4 million slaves were formally freed, and the tempo of industrialization and the growth of the working class were enormously speeded up all over the country. The Negro people and the working class. In the war. In this long and bloody war the oppressed Negro people displayed boundless heroism. In many ways they sabotaged the war efforts of the South. They captured Confederate steamers and brought them into northern ports, and they were the major source of military intelligence for the North. In the plantation areas the slaves' spirit of rebellion was so pronounced that the South was compelled to divert a large section of its armed forces to the task of keeping them suppressed. The heroism and abandon with which the newly freed slaves fought in the Union armies amazed the white soldiers and officers. Characteristic of many similar reports was the statement of Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson. "It would have been madness to attempt with the bravest white troops what I successfully accomplished with black ones." The action of the almost legendary Negro woman, Harriet Tubman, who led many forays deep into the South to free slaves, was bravery in its supremest sense. And when Lincoln was urged in 1864 to give up the use of Negro troops, he replied, "Take from us and give to the enemy the 130, 40, or 50,000 colored persons now serving us as soldiers, seamen, and laborers, and we cannot longer maintain the contest." Together with the approximately 200,000 Negro fighters in the Northern Army and Navy, there were also about 250,000 more employed in various capacities with the armed forces. Aptheker quotes government figures estimating that over 36,000 Negro soldiers died during the war. He states that the mortality rate among the United States colored troops in the Civil War was 35% greater than that among other troops, notwithstanding the fact that the former were not enrolled until some 18 months after the fighting began. Of the enlisted personnel of the Northern Navy, about 1/4 were Negroes, and of these Aptheker estimates approximately 3,200 died of disease and in battle. These gallant fighting services were recompensed at first by paying the Negro soldiers at lower rates than the white soldiers. Organized labor also played a large and heroic part in the Civil War. The outbreak of the war found the great mass of the workers backing the war as a struggle to stop the further extension of slavery. Only a small section supported the advanced stand of the Marxists, who demanded abolition. A small minority of workers, the most backward elements in the big commercial centers of Boston and New York, were strongly under the anti-war influence of the Copperheads. There was also a small but influential group that opposed all wars on pacifist grounds. All through the war, the workers suffered the most ruthless exploitation from the profiteering capitalists. Price gouging was rampant, and the capitalists brazenly used every means to cheat the government and to enrich themselves. The call for volunteers received a tremendous response from the workers. Overnight, regiments were organized in various crafts. Foreign-born workers responded with great enthusiasm. Among the labor contingents to enlist were the DeKalb Regiment of German clerks, the Polish League, and a company of Irish laborers. One of the first regiments to move in the defense of Washington was organized by the noted labor leader, William Silvis, who only a few months before had voted against Lincoln. It has been estimated that about 50% of the industrial workers enlisted. T.V. Powderly, head of the Knights of Labor, was not far wrong when he declared years later that in the Civil War, the great bulk of the army was made up of working men. At the start of the war, the labor movement was in a weakened condition, not yet having fully recovered from the ravages of the 1857 economic crisis. In the main, organized labor followed the bourgeoisie led by Lincoln, without as yet entering the struggle as a class having its own political organization and full consciousness of its specific aims. There was an actual basis for this course, inasmuch as the interests of the workers, in the fight against slavery, coincided with those of the northern industrialists. As the war progressed, labor's line strengthened and the workers became a powerful force pressing for the freedom of the slaves and for a revolutionary prosecution of the war. Role and strategy of the Marxists. In the war period, the war record of the Marxists, predecessors of the Communist Party of today, was one of the most inspiring chapters in the annals of the Civil War. Their response to Lincoln's call for volunteers set a good example for the entire nation. Within a few days, the New York Turners, Marxists, organized a whole regiment. The Missouri Turners put 3 regiments in the field. The communist clubs and German workers' leagues sent over half their members into the armed forces. The Marxists fought valorously on many battlefields. Joseph Weidemeyer, formerly an artillery officer in the German army, recruited an entire regiment, rose to the position of colonel, and was assigned by Lincoln as commander of the highly strategic area of St. Louis. August Willich, who became a brigadier general, Robert Rosa, a major, and Fritz Jacobi, a lieutenant who was killed at Fredericksburg, were all members of the New York Communist Club. There were many other Marxists at the front. The American Marxists, taught by Marx and Engels, had a more profound understanding of the nature of the war than any other group in the nation. They realized that a defeat for the Union forces would mean the end of the most advanced bourgeois democratic republic and a retrogression to semi-feudal conditions. Victory for the North, they knew, would greatly advance democracy. They understood the war as a basic conflict of 2 opposed systems, which could only be resolved by revolutionary measures. Hence, from the very beginning, the Marxists raised the decisive slow GANs of emancipation of the slaves, arming of the freedmen, confiscation of the planters' estates, and distribution of the land among the landless Negro and white masses. They understood, too, the Marxist policy of cooperation with the bourgeoisie when it was fighting for progressive ends. During the war, they tended to strengthen the position of the working class and its Negro and farmer allies and practically, if not consciously, to make them the leading force in the war coalition. They fought against pacifism and against Copperhead influences within and without labor's ranks. A major service of the Marxists was in helping to defeat the aspirations of Fremont to get the Republican nomination away from Lincoln in 1864. Marx urged the working class to make the outcome of the Civil War count in the long run for the workers as much as the outcome of the war for independence had counted for the bourgeoisie. This, however, the weak forces of the workers were unable to do. Nevertheless, their relative clarity of political line and their tireless spirit made the Marxists a political force far out of proportion to their still very small numbers. During the Civil War, Karl Marx himself played a vitally important part, his genius displaying great brilliance. Marx's many writings in the New York Daily Tribune and elsewhere constituted an outstanding demonstration of the power of revolutionary theory in interpreting developments, in seeing their inherent connections, and in understanding the direction in which the classes were moving. From the inception of the conflict and through every one of its crucial stages, Karl Marx, incomparably deeper than any other person, grasped the basic significance of events and projected the necessary line of policy and action. Lenin considered this a model example of how the creators of the Communist Manifesto defined the tasks of the proletariat in application to the different stages of the struggle. Far better than the northern bourgeois leaders, Marx clearly understood that here was a conflict between 2 opposing social systems, which must be fought out to the victory of one or the other system. He blasted those who believed that it was just a big quarrel over states' rights which could be smoothed over. He criticized the bourgeois leaders of the North for abasing themselves before the Southern slave power, and he pressed Lincoln again and again to take decisive action. From the outbreak of hostilities, Marx urged the North to wage the struggle in a revolutionary manner, as the only possible way to win the victory. He demanded that Lincoln raise the full-throated cry of emancipation of slavery. He called for the arming of the Negro slaves, and he pointed out the tremendous psychological effects that would be produced by the formation of even a single regiment of Negro soldiers. In the most discouraging times of the war, Marx never despaired of the North's ultimate victory. His and Engels' proposals for military strategy were no less sound than their penetrating political analysis. Marx clearly gave the theoretical lead to the Northern Democratic forces in the Civil War. Marx, as the leader of the First International, exerted a powerful influence in mobilizing the workers of England and the continent in support of the Northern cause. With his position as correspondent to the important Die Press of Vienna, Marx was also able to influence general European opinion regarding the decisive events in America. He upheld the Union cause in his inaugural address to the International and in 3 major official political documents addressed by that organization. In less than a year, to President Lincoln, President Johnson, and the National Labor Union, the British ruling class, despite all their pretended opposition to slavery, wanted nothing better than to intervene in the war on the side of the Confederacy. If they were prevented from doing this, it was primarily due to the militant anti-slavery attitude of the British working class, who hearkened to the advice of Marx and developed a powerful anti-slavery movement. As Marx said, it was not the wisdom of the ruling classes, but the heroic resistance to their criminal folly by the working classes of England that saved the west of Europe from plunging headlong into an infamous crusade for the perpetuation and propagation of slavery on the other side of the Atlantic. History records few such effective demonstrations of international labor solidarity. Lincoln himself recognized this when, addressing the Manchester textile workers who were starving because of the cotton blockade, he characterized their support as an instance of sublime Christian heroism which has not been surpassed in any age and any country. Lincoln also thanked the First International for its assistance, and the United States Senate, on March 2, 1863, joined in tribute to the British workers. The international support of labor was a real factor in bringing to a successful conclusion this world historic, progressive and revolutionary war, as Lenin called it. 1 Karl Marx, Inaugural Address, September 28, 1864, in founding of the First International. 4. The International. W. Workingmen's Association, 1864–1876. The International Workingmen's Association was founded in London on September 28, 1864. Its leading organizer and political leader was Karl Marx. The IWA was formed during a period of rising political struggle in Europe and the United States. It was the first international organization of the rapidly growing trade union and socialist movements of the period, the first great realization of Marx's famous slogan, "Workingmen of all countries, unite." The IWA was committed to a program of the complete emancipation of the working class. Engels described it as an association of workingmen embracing the most progressive countries of Europe and America, and concretely demonstrating the international character of the socialist movement to the workingmen themselves as well as to the capitalists and governments. The Marxists began to build the IWA in the United States shortly after the Civil War, in 1867. Section Number 1, formed in 1869, was an amalgamation of the German General Workers' Union and the Communist Club of New York. The combined group was called the Social Party of New York. Toward the end of 1872, additional sections, French and Bohemian, were set up. These first 3 sections established the North American Federation of the IWA, with F. A. Sorge as corresponding secretary of the Central Committee. By 1872, the IWA had Go sections, with a membership of over 5,000, distributed in many parts of the country. From revolution to counter-revolution, the IWA, a most important stage in the development of American Marxism, for the first time provided at least a loose national center for the groups of Marxists, and began to function during the most crucial era of American history. With the defeat of the slave owners in the Civil War, the revolution had completed but its first phase, the freeing of the slaves. It was now necessary to confiscate the planters' estates, to give one-sided by Morris Hillquit, History of Socialism in the United States, p. 178, n. y. 1903. Land to the Negro ex-slaves, and also to prevent the return to power of the defeated slavocracy. These were the revolutionary tasks of the Reconstruction period. The bourgeoisie was split over these basic questions. The left, or radical Republicans, led by Stevens, called for a democratic reconstruction of the South, whereas the right forces, grouped around President Johnson, after Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, wanted to halt the revolution and to restore the landowners to power in the South. In December 1865, the Stevens forces, who controlled Congress, succeeded in rejecting Johnson's reactionary Reconstruction program, and they also passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. During 1866, after scoring a victory in the hard-fought elections of that year, they enacted the Civil Rights Bill, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, and the 14th Amendment, providing for equal rights of Negroes and whites. In 1867, they also put through the Reconstruction Acts. The sum total of these measures was to give the Negro people a minimum of freedom, but not the land which they so basically needed. The Negro freedmen, with strong revolutionary initiative and consciousness, organized people's conventions, engaged actively in political action, elected many high Negro officials in local and state governments, and in various places fought arms in hand for the all-important land. Together with their white allies, they played an important part in many of the Reconstruction period state governments in the South, and they wrote a large amount of advanced and progressive legislation. They gave a brilliant demonstration of their political capacity. There were two Negro U.S. Senators, H.R. Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, both of Mississippi, between 1870 and 1881. 14 Negroes were members of the House during the same general period. There were also Negro lieutenant governors in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, as well as large numbers of Negro state and local officials in many southern states. Karl Marx, with his great revolutionary knowledge and experience, understood the need of consolidating the victory won during the Civil War, and he anticipated the danger of counter-revolution. In the famous September 1865 address to the people of the United States of the General Council of the IWA, Marx warned the American people to declare your fellow citizens from this day forth free and equal, without any reserve. If you refuse them citizens' rights while you exact from them citizens' duties, you will sooner or later face a new struggle which will once more drench your country in blood. This was the general line of the IWA forces in the United States, but the American Marxists did not fully understand how to make the fight against the counter-revolution. The working class, supported by the farmers and Negroes, was the only class that could have carried through the bourgeois democratic revolution of 1861–65 to completion in the Reconstruction period. But it was much too immature politically to accomplish this huge task. Preoccupied as it was with its urgent economic problems and afflicted with petty bourgeois illusions, labor did not yet understand its true role as leader of all the oppressed. It could not, therefore, rally its natural allies, the working farmers and Negro people, against the growing reaction of northern industrialists and southern planters. Consequently, the counter-revolution triumphed in the South. The northern bourgeoisie had accomplished its major purposes by the Civil War. It smashed the national political control of the planters, it held the country intact, it removed the principal barriers to rapid capitalist development, it won complete control of the government. This was what it sought. With northern capital grown enormously stronger during the war and no longer fearing its old-time enemy, the planters, the bourgeoisie sought to make the latter its obedient allies, and it had no interest whatever in creating a body of free Negro farmers in the South. It wanted instead to put a halt to the revolution. Hence, during the presidency of Andrew Johnson, the northern capitalists, after defeating the Stevens radicals, arrived at a tacit agreement with the planters. Whereby, with Ku Klux Klan violence, the latter were able to repress the Negro people and to force them down into the system of peonage in which they still live. This was a characteristic example of how the ruling, exploiting class, faced by a revolutionary situation, has resorted to terrorism and illegal counter-revolutionary violence. Stimulated by the requirements of the war and released from the restraints of the slavocracy, industrial development, especially in the North, advanced at an unprecedented pace during the next decades. Heavy industry and the railroads recorded a very rapid expansion. The concentration of industries and the growth of corporations were among the significant features of the times. The bourgeoisie hastened to use its new political power to plunder the public domain and the public treasury. Thus the Civil War set off roaring decades of expansion and speculation, and a wild orgy of graft and corruption. It was the Gilded Age. The swift development of capitalism also caused a rapid realignment of class forces, and the sharpening of all class antagonisms. The Marxists and the National Labor Union. The broad expansion of capitalism, the increase in the number of industrial workers, and the intensification of labor exploitation during the Civil War decade also brought about a rapid growth in the trade union movement. Thus, in 1863 there were 79 local unions in 20 crafts, and a year later the figure had jumped up to 270 locals in 53 crafts. With the end of the war the tempo of growth became still faster. The need for a general national organization of labor grew acute. After an ineffectual effort with the Industrial Assembly of America in 1864, success came with the setting up of the National Labor Union in Baltimore on August 26, 1866. Joseph Weidemeyer, the Marxist leader, who contributed greatly to its founding, died of cholera in St. Louis on the day the NLU convention began. Marxist influence was definitely a factor in this great stride forward of the working class, but the NLU was not a Marxist organization. In all the industrial centers the socialists were active trade union builders, and they had a number of delegates at the Baltimore Convention. William H. Silvis of the Molders Union and leader of the National Labor Union, although not a Marxist, was a friend of Wedemeyer and Sorge and also a supporter of the IWA. He had a great talent for organization and was the first real national trade union leader. William J. Jessup, head of the New York Carpenters, was in direct communication with the General Counsel of the IWA. A. C. Cameron, editor of the Working Man's Advocate, reprinted in full all the addresses of the IWA General Counsel, as well as many articles by Marx, Wilhelm Liebknecht, and Sorge. Ira Stewart, noted 8-hour day leader, read parts of Capital and was profoundly impressed by it. Even Samuel Gompers, then a young member of the labor movement and a friend of Sorge, was affected by the IWA. He said, "I became interested in the International, for its principles appealed to me as solid and practical." Of this time Gompers declared, "Unquestionably, in these early days of the 70s the International dominated the labor movement in New York City. The NLU during its 6 years of existence led important struggles and developed much correct basic labor policy. One of its main activities was campaigning for the 8-hour day. As a result of these efforts, Congress, on June 25, 1868, passed a law according the 8-hour day to laborers, mechanics, and all other workers in federal employ. The NLU was also active in defending the unemployed, and it was the first trade union movement in the world to advocate equal pay for women and men doing equal work. Kate Mullany, an outstanding union fighter, was appointed by Silvis in 1868 as assistant secretary and organizer of women. The NLU also campaigned against child labor and for the organization of the unorganized in all crafts and industries. The founders of the NLU understood the need for independent political action. This led to the formation of the Labor Reform Party in 1871. The NLU and the Labor Reform Party, however, fell into the hands of opportunists and reformers, who finally ran both of them into the ground. This trend was hastened by the sudden death of Silvis in July 1869. The Marxists took an active part in all NLU activities. They were militant builders of the trade unions and advocates of independent political action. They participated in all the strikes and other struggles of the period. They helped to organize the historic 8-hour day parade in New York in 1871. In this parade a large IWA contingent marched with the 20,000 workers, carrying through the streets of the city for the first time a red banner inscribed with the slogan, "Workingmen of all countries, unite." As the IWA section entered the City Hall Plaza, it was greeted with lusty cheers from the 5,000 assembled, who shouted, "Vive la Commune." The Marxists were also a leading factor in the Great Tompkins Square, New York, demonstration of the unemployed in 1874. During this period of activity one of the big achievements of the IWA was to secure the affiliation of the United Irish Workers, a group of Irish laborers. They were led by J. P. MacDonald, an able Marxist, a Fenian and co-worker of Marx in the First International Congresses. MacDonald, a capable and active trade unionist, was very effective in organizing the unorganized. For many years he was the editor of the Labor Standard, the leading trade union journal of the period. Gompers called him the Nestor of trade union editors. The NLU and the Negro question. During these years the question of Negro labor was a burning issue for the labor movement. The bosses were systematically playing the white workers against the newly freed Negro workers, and were trying to use Negro workers to keep down the wages of all workers, even as strikebreakers. More advanced leaders of the NLU, especially the Marx ISDS, had some conception of the necessity of Negro and white labor solidarity and of the NLU undertaking the organization of the freedmen. But, despite Silvis, Richard Trevelick, and others, nothing much was done about it. Strong Jim Crow practices existed in many of the unions, and consequently the body of Negro workers were not organized nor their interests protected. As a result, the Negro workers launched their own organization. In December 1869, after failure of the NLU to give the Negro workers consideration at its convention a few months earlier, they called together a convention of 156 delegates, mostly from the South, and organized the National Colored Labor Union, with Isaac Myers as president. Trevelick was present, representing the NLU. The convention elected 5 delegates to attend the next convention of the NLU. The NCLU also set up, as headquarters, the National Bureau of Labor in Washington. Its paper was the New National Era. 1 inches. In February 1870, the Bureau issued a prospectus containing the chief demands of the Negro people. It called for a legislative body to fight for legislation which would gain equality before the law for Negroes. It proposed an educational campaign to overcome the opposition of white mechanics to Negroes in the trades. It recommended cooperatives and homesteads to the Negro people. Relations between the NLU and NCLU became strained over a number of questions. They reached the breaking point on the formation of the National Land Reform Party. That this first great effort to establish unity between Negro and white workers failed was to be ascribed chiefly to the short-sighted policies of the white leaders of the NLU. They never understood the burning problems of the Negro people during the Reconstruction period, some of them holding ideas pretty much akin to those of President Johnson. The NCLU soon disappeared under the fierce pressure of the mounting reaction in the South. The Marxists, both within and without the NLU, were active on the Negro question, primarily in a trade union sense. They demanded the repeal of all laws discriminating against Negroes. Section No. 1 of the IWA set up a special committee to organize Negro workers into trade unions. Consequently, the Negro people looked upon the socialists as trustworthy friends to whom they could turn for cooperation. In the big New York 8-hour day parade, Negro union groups participated with the IWA contingent. And in the parade against the execution of the Communards, a company of Negro militia, the Skidmore Guards, marched under the banner of the First International. The NLU and the First International. From its beginning, the National Labor Union had a strong international spirit. This was largely due to German Marxist and English Chartist influences within its ranks. It maintained friendly relations with the International Workingmen's Association. Marx was highly gratified at the founding of the new National Labor Center in the United States. The question of affiliation to the IWA occupied a prominent place at all NLU conventions. Silvis especially appreciated the importance of the international solidarity of the workers. At the 1867 convention of the NLU, President W. J. Jessup moved to affiliate with the IWA, with the backing of Silvis. The convention did not vote for affiliation, however, but it did agree to send Richard F. Trevelick to the next IWA Congress. Lack of funds, however, prevented his going. Good cooperative relations always existed between the two organizations, Karl Marx paying special attention to the promising NLU. Finally, late in 1869, A.C. Cameron attended the IWA Congress at Ball as the representative of the NLU. There he presented several proposals, providing for cooperation between European and American labor to regulate immigration and to prevent the shipping of scabs to break strikes in the United States. The 1870 convention of the NLU, while not actually voting affiliation to the IWA, nevertheless adopted a resolution which endorsed the principles of the International Workingmen's Association and expressed the intention of affiliating with it at no distant date. The death of Silvis in 1869 was a heavy blow to the growing international labor solidarity. Commons says, had it not been for this loss of its leader, the alliance of the National Labor Union with the International, judging from Silvis' correspondence, would have been speedily brought about. The General Council of the IWA sent a letter to the NLU, signed by Karl Marx, mourning the loss of Silvis. It said that his death, by removing a loyal, persevering, and indefatigable worker in the good cause from among you, has filled us with great grief and sorrow. The decline of the National Labor Union. The NLU reached its high point, with an estimated 600,000 members, in 1869. After that date it began to decline, and its decay was rapid. At its 1871 convention there were only 22 delegates, and these mostly agrarian reformers. The American section of the IWA, which was affiliated, quit in discontent at the way the organization was being run. The 1872 convention brought forth only 7 delegates, old-time leaders. This was the end of the NLU. Attempts were made to call conventions to revive it, in 1873 and 1874 at Columbus and Rochester, but these efforts were fruitless, the organization being dead beyond recall. Numerous reasons combined to bring about the end of the once promising National Labor Union. Among these was the fact that the organization was not definitely a trade union body. From the outset it was composed of trade unions, workers' associations, and 8-hour leagues, and in the end it had been invaded by numerous preachers, editors, lawyers, and other careerists, who cultivated petty bourgeois illusions among the workers. Moreover, the organization was poorly financed, and it was too decentralized. It had no dues system, nor any paid, continuous leadership. Its main activity was the holding of national conventions, with the follow-up work being done by its affiliated organizations. Last and most important of its weaknesses, the organization, under the influence of Lassalleans, finally deprecated trade union action and turned its major attention to the currency question and to other petty bourgeois reformist political activities. This alienated the trade unions, which quit the organization, and it fell a prey to all sorts of non-working class elements. As early as 1870, Sorge wrote a letter to Karl Marx in which he clearly foresaw the course of events. The National Labor Union, which had such brilliant prospects in the beginning of its career, was poisoned by Greenbackism and is slowly but surely dying. The influence of the Marxists upon the NLU was much too limited to counteract these disintegrating influences. The National Labor Union, despite its short 6 years of life, played an important part in the development of the American labor movement. It was the successor of the National Trades Union of the 1830s and the predecessor of the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. It was a pioneer in the organization of Negro workers, in the defense of the rights of women and all other workers, in the organization of independent political action, and in the development of the international solidarity of the working class. The traditions of struggle that Silvis and his co-workers left behind them will long be an inspiration to the forces of American labor. They are vivid in the Communist Party of today, e.e. the Marxists and the LASSALLEANS. During the period of the International Workingmen's Association, a major ideological struggle of the Marxists was directed against Lassalleanism. Ferdinand Lassalle in 1863 organized the General Association of German Workers in Germany, the program of which was to win universal suffrage and then to use the workers' votes to secure state credits for producers' cooperatives. This Lassalle saw as the road to socialism. 1. He considered as futile the trade union struggle of the workers for better economic conditions. This rejection he based upon his theory of the iron law of wages, which assumed that the average wages of workers, always down to minimum levels, could not be raised by economic action. Hence trade unionism was useless. The German immigrants brought Lassalle's ideas with them, and these gained considerable currency among the German workers in the United States. In this country, where the workers already had the vote, apparently all that remained for them to do was to use their ballots to gain control of the government and then to apply Lassalle's scheme of state-financed cooperatives. Whereupon, the workers' problems would be solved. This theory led to extremely pernicious results in practice. It meant the weakening of the everyday struggles of the workers and the Negro people. It led to neglect and isolation from the trade unions. It tended to reduce the workers' struggle to opportunist political activity. Lassalleanism was largely responsible for the fatal lessening of the basic trade union economic functions of the National Labor Union, where it exerted great influence. Seeing the unions breaking up during the big economic crisis of 1873 and in the lost strikes of the period, many workers lost faith in trade unionism and gave ear to the Lassallean illusions. From the first appearance of Lassalleanism, the Marxists, led by Sorge, took issue actively with its theory and practice, showing it to be false and injurious. Of great help to the American Marxists in this struggle was Marx's celebrated polemic against Weston in England, which was published, after Marx's death, under the title, Value, Price and Profit. In this pamphlet Marx proved conclusively that whereas the trend of capitalism is to bring about the relative and absolute impoverishment of the workers, the latter, by resolute economic and political action, can nevertheless secure a larger share of the value which they create. Marx demonstrated that while it was possible to abolish exploitation only by abolishing capitalism, the workers can successfully resist the efforts of the capitalists to force them down to a bare subsistence level. The fight between the Marxists and Lassalleans raged with special sharpness for several years during the 1870s in all the journals and branches of the IWA, and it was also reflected in the trade unions. In this struggle the Marxists stood foursquare for strong trade unions and for active economic struggle. They also contended that the workers should put up candidates in elections only when they had solid trade union backing. Good theory and the stern realities of life fought on the side of the Marxists. The workers, faced with hard necessity, continued to build their unions and to strike, and the opportunistic political campaigns of the Lassalleans suffered one defeat after another. The Lassalleans fought a losing battle. Gompers, at that time a radical young trade unionist, sided with the Marxists in this historic struggle. During the course of the controversy, in 1874, the Lassalleans organized the Labor Party in Illinois and the Social Democratic Party of North America in the East. They had their own journal, the Vorbote. Most active in these Lassallean developments were Karl Klinge and Adolf Strasser, the cigar-maker, who later played a prominent part with Gompers in the formation of the American Federation of Labor. The Marxists gradually won a large measure of control over the Lassallean journals and organizations and eventually gave them a Marxist program. Besides this fight against the right, against the Lassalleans, the American Marxists, with the active advice of Marx and Engels, also conducted a struggle against the deep-seated and persistent left sectarianism within the IWA. Among the current manifestations of this disease were tendencies among the German socialist workers to neglect to learn the English language and the American customs, to isolate themselves from the broad American masses in their daily struggles, to launch trade unions solely of German workers and dual to existing labor organizations, and generally to fail to apply Marxist principles concretely to American conditions. Some years later Engels, dealing with the still persisting sectarianism in the United States, stated, "IHE Germans have not understood how to use their theory as a lever which could set the American masses in motion. They do not understand the theory themselves for the most part and treat it in a doctrinaire and dogmatic way, as something which has got to be learned off by heart but which will then supply all needs without more ado. To them it is a credo and not a guide to action." Marx was equally outspoken in his criticism of this doctrinaire and sectarian weakness in the United States. Dissolution of the First International. The years of the International Workingmen's Association were full of storm and struggle. Organized reaction in Europe, frightened at the revolutionary implications of the International, waged ruthless war against it. This was particularly true after the defeat of the historic Paris Commune in 1871. The IWA was outlawed in France and other countries. But more effective in bringing the First International to an end were profound internal ideological weaknesses. To correct these, numerous theoretical and practical battles were waged by the Marxists to establish Marxism as the predominant working-class ideology. They fought against the opportunist trade union leaders in England, against the Proudhonists in France, against the Lassalleans in Germany, and against the Bakuninists on a general scale. The fight against the Bakuninists was the most severe. Michael Bakunin, a Russian anarchist, led a determined struggle to wrest the leadership of the world's workers away from the Marxists. In 1868, he organized the so-called Black International, with a program of anti-political, putschist violence, and he demanded affiliation with the IWA. Refused by the General Council, Bakunin carried the fight into the 1869 Congress of the IWA at Bâle, Switzerland. Marx won the day, with a substantial majority. In the ensuing split, Bakunin was able to carry with him important French, Spanish, and Belgian organizations. The struggle grew very bitter, and at its 1872 Congress the IWA, in view of the unfavorable internal and external situation, decided to move its headquarters to New York. F.A. Sorge was chosen as secretary. The difficulties which beset the First International on a world scale also, with variations, afflicted its American section. The IWA in the United States, in view of the political immaturity of the working class and the socialist movement, was undermined by all sorts of reformists, pure and simple trade unionists, Lassalleans, and Bakuninist anarchists. The IWA, after shifting its headquarters to the United States, continued for 4 more years. But, on July 15, 1876, at its Philadelphia Convention, which was attended almost exclusively by American delegates, the First International formally dissolved itself. 13 years would pass before a new international would take the place of the IWA, but in the United States, as we shall see later, the dissolution was but a prelude to a new upward swing of Marxism. During its 12 years of existence, the International Workingmen's Association in the United States contributed much to the development of the socialist movement. At the beginning, it found a few scattered groups of Marxists with an uncertain ideology. It greatly strengthened their Marxist understanding, and it did much to unite them as a national grouping. In short, it laid the ideological and organizational foundations of the structure which has finally become the modern Communist Party. On an international scale, the IWA did immense work in giving the workers a revolutionary outlook and in building their mass trade unions and political parties. The First International raised the world's labor movement out of its former muddle of utopian societies and half-socialist sects and gave it a scientific Marxist groundwork. In the words of Lenin, it laid the foundation of the international organization of the workers in order to prepare their revolutionary onslaught on capital, the foundation of their international proletarian struggle for socialism. 5. The Socialist Labor Party, 1876 to 1890. For a quarter of a century, from the dissolution of the International Workingmen's Association in 1876 to the foundation of the Socialist Party in 1900, the Socialist Labor Party was the standard-bearer of Marxism in the United States. This marked the next big stage in the prehistory of the Communist Party. The decades of the SLP were a period of intense industrialization, of growing monopoly capitalism and imperialism, of sharpening class struggles, of many of the greatest strikes in our national history, of big farmer movements, and of the gradual consolidation of Marxism into an organized force in the United States. The need for a Marxist party being imperative, the socialist forces proceeded to reorganize one in Philadelphia, July 19–22, 1876, just a few days after the old IWA was dissolved in that same city. The new body was the Workingmen's Party of America, the following year to be named the Socialist Labor Party. It was based primarily upon a fusion of the Marxist elements of the IWA, headed by F.A. Sorge and Otto Weidemeyer, son of Joseph Weidemeyer, and of the Lassallean forces of the Illinois Labor Party and the Social Democratic Party, led by Adolf Strasser, A. Gabriel, and P. J. McGuire. All told, there were about 3,000 members represented. The Philadelphia Founding Convention had been preceded by a unity conference in Pittsburgh 3 months earlier. The Lassalleans at the convention succeeded in securing a majority of the National Committee of the new party, and they also elected one of their number, Philip Van Patten, to the post of National Secretary. In the shaping of policy, however, the influence of the Marxists was predominant. The party demanded the nationalization of railroads, telegraphs, and all means of transportation, and it called for all industrial enterprises to be placed under the control of the government as fast as practicable and operated by free cooperative trade unions for the good of the whole people. Asterisk. The Declaration of Principles was taken from the General Statutes of the IWA, and in the vital matters of trade unionism and political action, the party's program unequivocally took the position of the old International. That is, the new party would energetically support trade unionism and would base its parliamentary activity upon substantial trade union backing. A program of immediate demands was also adopted, and the party headquarters was established in Chicago. J. P. McDonnell became editor of the party's English organ, the Labor Standard, and Dewey was made assistant editor of all party publications. Organizational, if not ideological, unity was thus established. The conflicting Marxist and Lassallean groups went right on with their disputes in the new organization. Lassallean opportunism, although as such a declining force during the next decade, was soon to graduate into its lineal political descendant, pseudo-Marxist right opportunism. The SLP and the Great Railroad Strike. The economic crisis of 1873 was one of the severest in American history. The employers, taking advantage of the huge unemployment, slashed wages on all sides. The workers desperately replied with a series of bitter strikes, such as this country had never before experienced. These strikes were mainly spontaneous, most of the unions having fallen to pieces during the economic crisis. In 1874–75, there were broad, hard-fought strikes in the textile and mining industries. The Long Strike of 1875 in the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania culminated in the hanging of 10 Irish workers and the imprisonment of 24 others, as Molly Maguires. They were falsely charged with murder, arson, and other violence against the mine owners. This was another of the many shameful labor frame-up cases that have disfigured American history. The most important strike of this period, however, was the Big Railroad Strike of 1877. This reached the intensity of virtual civil war. Beginning in Martinsburg, West Virginia, on July 17, 1877, all crafts, Negro and white, struck against a deep wage slash. Like a prairie fire, the spontaneous strike spread over many railroads, from coast to coast. The existing weak railroad brotherhoods, led by conservatives, were but a small factor. For the first time, the United States found itself in the grip of a national strike. The government proceeded ruthlessly to break the strike. The big railroad centers were flooded with militia and federal troops. About 100,000 soldiers were under arms. In many places the soldiers fraternized with the strikers, in others they fired upon the crowds, and in some places the militant strikers drove them out. Many scores were killed. Finally, the desperate strike was crushed. The workers learned at bitter cost the need for strong unions and organized political action. This near civil war deeply shook all sections of the population throughout the land. The Workingmen's Party was very active in this great strike, as in all others of the period. The party executive urged the workers and the public to support the strike. It raised the 8-hour demand and called for nationalization of the railroads. In Chicago, a socialist stronghold, the party organized an effective general strike. "Chicago is in possession of the communists," shrieked the newspapers. Albert R. Parsons was then one of the most active party leaders in Chicago. The leadership of the socialists in St. Louis was also equally outstanding, and it made the strike very effective. "This is a labor revolution," cried the local paper, The Republican. For a week the party-led strike committee was in virtual possession of St. Louis. Finally, the strike was crushed by troops and the wholesale arrest of the strikers' leaders. Activities were carried on by the party in other strike centers. For the Workingmen's Party, all this was a new and tremendous experience in leading huge masses in struggle. It was a powerful blow against the sectarian barriers that were separating the party from the workers. Marx and Engels hailed the great mass struggle. In its 1877 convention, the party changed its name to the Socialistic Labor Party of North America. The party grew rapidly. By 1879 it had 10,000 members in 25 states, and between 1876 and 1878, 24 papers were established. During this critical period, in 1877, there was published in the United States the famous scientific work, Ancient Society, by Lewis Henry Morgan. It was primarily a study of the social organization of the Iroquois Indians and perhaps the most important book ever written in the Western Hemisphere. Engels declared that it is one of the few epoch-making books of our times. Morgan was not a socialist, but Engels said of him that, in his own way, he discovered afresh in America the materialist conception of history discovered by Marx 40 years ago. Workers' and farmers' political struggles. Following the big strikes of 1877, the workers, outraged by the brutal suppression methods of the government, took a sharp turn toward political action. Labor parties sprang up in many cities and states. In the meantime, the farmers, under the pressure of the severe economic crisis, also embarked upon political activity. They created the Greenback Party, whose cure-all panacea was the issuance of paper money greenbacks, hopefully to pay off the farmers' mortgages, to liquidate the national debt, and to finance a general prosperity. In the 1876 elections, the workers' parties refused to support the Greenback Party because it had no labor demands in its program. By 1878, however, there had developed a farmer-labor alliance, the National Greenback Labor Party. This party, which by then included in its program minimum labor demands, scored considerable success in the elections of that year, polling its high vote of 1,050,000 and sending 15 members to Congress. The capitalist press shouted that the communist revolution was at hand. But it was an uneasy alliance of workers and farmers. Labor's forces resented the domination of the party by businessmen and big farmers, and they also reacted against the minor stress that was placed upon the workers' demands. Disintegration of the party, therefore, set in, so that in the 1880 presidential elections its candidate, General Weaver, got only 300,000 votes. The Greenback Labor Party was already far along the road to oblivion. The Marxists generally took a position of participating in these important political struggles. They actively supported the building of the local and state workingmen's parties, and they also endorsed the general plan of a worker-farmer political alliance. They raised demands, too, for the Negro workers. However, they had opposed supporting the Greenback Party in the 1876 elections on the sound ground that it did not defend the workers' interests. In the 1878 elections, considerable socialist support was given to the Greenback Labor Party candidates, and in 1880 a national endorsement of that party's candidates was extended by the Socialist Labor Party. In the carrying out of this general line there was gross opportunism. The Lassalleans, headed by Van Patten and other middle-class intellectuals, controlled the party. Taking advantage of the heavy defeats suffered by the trade unions during the economic crisis and misinterpreting the swing of the workers toward political action, they held that the trade unions had proved themselves to be worthless and that thenceforth the party should devote itself exclusively to parliamentary political action. They elaborated upon this opportunism by making impermissible compromises with the Greenbackers and by surrendering to Dennis Carney of the Pacific Coast, with his reactionary slogan, "The Chinese must go." They also watered down the SLP program until it called for the abolition of capitalism by a step-at-a-time process. The Lassalleans, here and in Germany, were gradually dropping Lassalle's original utopian demand for state finance producers' cooperatives, and were being transformed into the characteristic right-wing social democrats, who were to wreak such havoc with the whole world's labor movement for many decades. The crass opportunism of the SLP right-wing leadership antagonized Sorge, Parsons, Schilling, McDonnell, and other Marxists and trade unionists in the party. The latter elements, in particular, insisted that the party should combine economic with political action. The party conventions from 1877 to 1881 were torn with quarrels over this issue. The factional split widened, minor secession movements developed, membership declined, papers succumbed, and the party sank into an internal crisis. Meanwhile, a new danger appeared on the horizon: anarcho-syndicalism. During the next few years, this was to threaten the very life of the Socialist Labor Party. The anarcho-syndical IST movement. Anarcho-syndicalism originated from a number of causes. Among these were the following. A. The extreme violence with which the government repressed strikes generated among workers the idea of meeting force with force. B. The robbing of workers' election candidates of votes tended to discredit working-class political action altogether. C. The fact that millions of immigrant workers had no votes also operated against organized political action. D. The opportunist policies of the reformist leadership of the SLP disgusted and repelled militant workers. E. The influence of petty bourgeois radicals upon the working class, and F. The injection of European anarchist ideas gave a specific ideological content to the movement. As early as 1875, to defend themselves, German workers in Chicago formed an armed group. This tendency spread rapidly, as a result of the government violence in the big 1877 strikes. In 1878, the SLP National Executive condemned the trend and ordered its advocates to leave the party. In October 1881, the supporters of direct action, led principally by Albert R. Parsons and August Spies, met in Chicago and organized the Revolutionary Socialist Labor Party. This movement, however, did not take on a definitely anarchist complexion until after the arrival of Johann Most, a German anarchist, in 1882. Most found willing hearers, and in October 1883, a joint convention of anarchists and members of the Revolutionary Socialist Labor Party was held. This convention formed the International Working People's Association. Its program proposed the destruction of the existing class government by all means, i.e., by energetic, implacable, revolutionary, and international action, and the establishment of a system of industry based on the free exchange of equivalent products between the production organizations. The program condemned the ballot as a device designed by the capitalists to fool the workers. The Chicago group, more syndicalist than anarchist, inserted the clause that the International recognizes in the trade union the embryonic group of the future society. Behind this movement was the anarchist anti-Marxist conception that socialism could be brought about by the desperate action of a small minority of the working class, impelling the masses into action. The opportunist-led SLP shriveled in the face of the strong drive of the anarcho-syndicalists. By 1883 the SLP membership had dwindled to but 1,500, whereas that of the International went up to about 7,000. Also, the latter's several journals were flourishing. In April 1883, after 6 years as SLP National Secretary, Van Patten suddenly disappeared, turning up later as a government jobholder. Shortly afterward attempts were made by prominent SLP members to fuse that organization with the anarcho-syndicalist group, but to no avail, the latter replying that the SLP members should join their organization individually. From then on it was an open struggle between the two parties. The Anarcho-Syndicalist International met shipwreck in May 1886 at Chicago. The militants of that organization were taking a leading part in the AFL trade union's big agitation for the national 8-hour general strike movement, which climaxed on May 1. At the McCormick Harvester plant 6 striking workers were killed by the police. The anarcho-syndicalists called a mass meeting of protest in the Haymarket on May 4, with Parsons, Spies, and Fielden as the principal speakers. Some unknown person threw a bomb, killing 7 police and 4 workers and wounding many more. In the wild hysteria following this event, Parsons, Fisher, Ling, Fielden, Schwab, Spies, Engel, and Niebe were arrested. After a criminally unfair trial, another on the growing list of labor frame-ups, they were all convicted. Niebe, Schwab, and Fielden were given long prison terms. Ling committed suicide while awaiting trial, and Parsons, Spies, Fisher and Engel were hanged on November 11, 1887. Governor John Altgeld, 6 years later, released the 4 remaining in prison and proclaimed their innocence. The Haymarket affair was a heavy blow especially to the International Group, and after a futile effort in 1887 to amalgamate with the SLP it dissolved. The substance of the Haymarket outrage was an attempt by the employers to destroy the young trade union movement. The Knights of Labor. With the revival of industry, beginning in 1879, trade unionism, weakened in the long economic crisis, again spread with great rapidity. To meet the fierce exploitation by the employers, the workers had to have organization. Local trades councils and labor assemblies grew in many cities, and small craft unions also began to take shape. The socialists, while only a small minority in the membership and leadership of the unions, were very active in all this work. The SLP Bulletin, in September 1880, declared that the formation of the central bodies has been accomplished mainly by the efforts of socialists who influence and in some places control these assemblies, and are respected in all of them. A serious attempt to organize the labor movement upon a national scale was made through the International Labor Union, formed early in 1878. This center developed out of the joint efforts of such socialists as Sorge, McDonnell, and Otto Weidemeyer, and also of the noted 8-hour day advocates, Ira Stewart and G. E. McNeil. The ILU laid heavy stress upon the 8-hour day, and advocated the ultimate emancipation of the working class. The organization finally developed, however, chiefly as a union of textile workers. It conducted a number of strikes, but was formally dissolved in 1887. More successful was the next big effort, the Knights of Labor. The Noble Order of the Knights of Labor was organized in Philadelphia in December 1869, by Uriah S. Stevens and a handful of workers. It was at first limited to garment workers, but in 1871 it expanded to see other trades. With the decline of the National Labor Union, the Knight of Labor grew, and by 1877 it had 15 district or state assemblies. Like various other labor unions of the period, the K of L was a secret organization with an elaborate ritual. It held its first General Assembly, National Convention, in Reading, Pennsylvania, in 1878, when it became an open body. The order grew rapidly in the aftermath of the GRE 1877 strikes and under the effects of reviving industry. In 1883, K of L had 52,000 members, in 1885, 111,000, and in 1886, its peak about 700,000. Stevens was its Grand Master workman until 187 cent when he was succeeded by T. V. Powderly, who served until 1893, at which time he was replaced by J. R. Sovereign. The K of L contained trends of Marxism, Lassalleanism, and, pure and simple, trade unionism. Its program set as its goal the Lassalle objective, to establish cooperative institutions such as will tend to supersede the wage system by the introduction of a cooperative IR. Industrial system. It proposed a legislative program which included labor, currency, and land reforms, and also government ownership of the railroads and telegraphs, as well as national control of banking. The Marxist influence was to be seen, chiefly in the many militant strikes of the KFL. The order considered craft unionism too narrow in spirit and scope, and it aimed at a broad organization of the whole working class. Its motto was, "An injury to one is the concern of all." The KFL accepted workers of all crafts into its local mixed assemblies. It had many Negro workers in its ranks and about 10% of its members were women. Professionals and small businessmen were also admitted, to the extent of 25% of the local membership. Although its conservative leadership, heavily influenced by Lassallean and outright bourgeois conceptions, deprecated strikes, even sinking to the level of actual strikebreaking, the KFL made its greatest progress as a result of economic struggles. During 1884–85 the organization was especially effective in a number of big strikes of telegraphers, miners, lumbermen, and railroaders. Harassed masses of workers turned hopefully to the new organization, and the employers viewed it with the gravest alarm. The KFL swiftly became a powerful force in the industrial struggle. It also was active politically, participating generally in the broad labor and farmer political movements of its era. The period of the rise of the KFL was one of internal crisis within the SLP, what with the crippling effects of the right-wing leadership, the continuing pest of sectarianism, and the severe struggle of the party against the anarcho-syndicalists. Nevertheless, the party did exercise a considerable influence in the KFL from its earliest period as an open organization, particularly in the local assemblies in various cities where German immigrant workers were in force. The American Federation of Labor. As the Knights of Labor developed, a new, rival union movement, eventually to become the AFL, also began to take shape. This was based upon the national craft unions, which could find no satisfactory place in the KFL. These organizations, some of which antedated the Civil War, objected to the mixed form of the KFL, to its autocratic centralized leadership, to its chief concern with other than direct trade union questions, and to its neglect of their specific craft interests. On more to their liking, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada. Marxist influence was manifest but not dominant in this new movement. Samuel Gompers, a Jewish immigrant cigar maker born in London, who was its leading spirit, had long been associated with Marxist circles. Indeed, he had probably belonged to the IWA, but later found it expedient to deny the fact. Gompers said that he had studied German so as to be able to read Marx's Das Kapital. Adolf Strasser, Ferdinand Laurel, and P. J. Maguire, close Gompers associates, had been members of the SLP. There were 8 SLP members present among the 107 delegates at the founding convention. Marxist conceptions also stood out in the new body's preamble, still in effect in the AFL today. This signalizes a struggle between capital and labor, which must grow in intensity from year to year. The Constitution, which granted a high measure of autonomy to the national unions, was copied almost verbatim from that of the British Trades Union Congress and its parliamentary committee. The general trade union programs of the KFL and the new Federation were similar, but there were also important differences. The Knights demanded government ownership of the systems of transportation and communication, but the new Federation did not. Nor did the Federation accept the monetary program of the Knights of Labor, indicating that it definitely regarded the industrial capitalist rather than the banker as the chief enemy of the wage earners, and, unlike the Knights, had pretty nearly rid itself of the belief in financial panaceas. It is also significant that the Federation made no reference to producers or consumers' cooperatives, and failed to recommend compulsory arbitration, which the Knights supported. The new Federation was evidently geared to limiting itself to concessions under capitalism, rather than aiming at the abolition of the existing regime of wage slavery. It was clear soon after its foundation that the new labor center, basing itself upon the skilled workers, was little concerned with the welfare of the masses of semi-skilled and unskilled. The AFL aimed chiefly at organizing the developing labor aristocracy, a policy which dovetailed with the employer policy of corrupting the skilled workers at the expense of the unskilled. An anti-Negro bias was also to be observed in the affiliated AFL unions, reflecting the employer's policy of discriminating against these workers. These were long steps backward from the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor. The KFL at its height, with some 700,000 members, had about 60,000 Negroes in its ranks, a figure not reached by the AFL for about 50 years, when it counted, however, a total of some 3 million members. At first the new federation was not considered as an enemy of the Knights of Labor. Thus, at its first convention, 47 of the 107 delegates came from KFL organizations. Potential antagonisms sharpened, however, and soon the two labor centers were at loggerheads. Efforts were made, especially by the AFL leaders in the early years, to harmonize and unite the two bodies, but these came to naught and the rivals fought it out, to the eventual disappearance of the Knights. For its first 5 years the Federation stagnated along, with only about 50,000 members. After its initial year Gompers was its president. At the Federation's second convention, in 1882, only 19 delegates attended. Nor were the 3 succeeding annual conventions any more promising. The attention of the workers, dazzled by the successful strikes of the K of L, was focused on that organization. But the great events of 1886 were soon radically to change the whole labor union situation. The national 8-hour fight. The developing class struggle after the Civil War reached a new height of militancy in the Great Fight for the 8-hour day in 1886. The agitation for this measure had been on the increase ever since the end of the war. Its foundation was the intensified exploitation to which the workers were being subjected. Marx called the 8-hour movement the first fruit of the Civil War. That ran with the 7-leagued boots, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Federation leaders, who were far more militant then than now, seized upon the shorter hours issue. Hovering on the brink of death, the Federation turned to the heroic measure of a universal strike which had been suggested a decade before by the Industrial Brotherhood. At its convention in Chicago in 1884 a resolution was adopted to the effect that from and after May 1, 1886, 8 hours shall constitute a day's work. The Federation put its forces behind the movement, but Powderly, the head of the Knights of Labor, a rank conservative, made the fatal mistake of opposing the strike. The general strike centered in Chicago, where the Parsons Shilling forces headed the Central Labor Union. Nationally, it was highly successful, some 350,000 workers, including large numbers of K of L members, going on strike. The 8-hour day was established in many sections, particularly in the building trades. And more important, despite the Haymarket outrage committed by the bosses, described earlier, a tremendous wave of trade union organization was set on its way. This laid the basis for the modern trade union movement. Out of this movement was born historic International May Day, which, however, the AFL, its creator, has never seen fit to celebrate, although AFL unions participated in May Day celebrations for many years. May 1st was adopted as the day of celebration of world labor at the International Socialist Congress in Paris, France, in July 1889. Since then, tens of millions of workers have marched on that day in every city of the world, in anticipation of the final victory of the working class. The 1886 strike virtually decided that the Federation and not the K of L would be the National Trade Union Center. At its December 1886 convention in Columbus, the original Federation, now with some 316,469 members, and growing rapidly, reorganized itself and adopted its new name of the American Federation of Labor. Although the K of L gained heavily in numbers as a result of the great 1886 struggle, it had definitely lost the leadership of labor and soon thereafter began to decline in strength. By 1890 it had only 200,000 members and was no longer the decisive labor factor. In the struggle for leadership the AFL had a number of advantages over the K of L. The craft form of organization, based on the key role of the skilled workers in this period, was superior to the hodgepodge mixed assemblies of the K of L. Its decentralized form was also more effective than the paralyzing over-centralization of the K of L. The AFL's policy of confining its membership strictly to workers likewise gave it a big advantage over the K of L, which took in large numbers of farmers, professionals, and small businessmen. Its strike policy, too, was a big improvement over the no-strike attitude of Powderly and his fellow bureaucrats. The rejection of current money nostrums and other social panaceas that infested the K of L also helped the AFL, and so did the opposition to the K of L's adventurous petty bourgeois political policies. Despite these advantages, which compared favorably with the Knights of Labor, the AFL program contained a whole series of weaknesses which were to manifest themselves with deadly effect in the coming decades. The AFL's gradual rejection of a socialist perspective implied its eventual outright acceptance of capitalism and a slave role for the working class. Its concentration upon the skilled workers finally developed into direct betrayal of the unskilled and the foreign-born masses. Its obvious white Peonians was a callous sellout of the action grew into a soreness to the fatal two-party system of the capitalists. Its general program, which through the years became a real adaptation of the labor movement to the profit interests of the powerful and arrogant monopolists, finally resulted in the wholesale corruption of the labor aristocracy, in the growth of a monstrous system of interunion scabbing, and eventually in the creation of the most corrupt and reactionary labor leadership the world had ever known. In the early years of the AFL the non-Marxist leadership of the unions, not yet solidly organized as a dominating clique, reflected some of the militancy of the rank and file under the latter's pressure. But with the development of American imperialism, particularly from 1890 on, they soon fell into the role allotted to them by the employers, as labor lieutenants of capital, basing themselves upon the skilled at the expense of the unskilled. They proceeded to build up the notorious Gompers machine, which ever since has been such a barrier to working-class progress. They were able to do this because of the whole complex of specifically American factors, related to the rapid growth of American industry, which had resulted in relatively high living standards for the workers as compared to those in other countries, and which were operating to prevent a rapid radicalization of the American working class. The Henry George Campaign. The Great 8-Hour Struggle naturally had important political repercussions for the workers. As the 1886 fall elections approached, the workers organized labor parties in a number of cities. The socialists were active in all these parties, which played a considerable role in the local elections. But by far the most important of such independent movements was the 1886 campaign of Henry George for mayor of New York City. Henry George, because of his notable book on the single tax, Progress and Poverty, published in 1879 and selling eventually up to several million copies, had gained a wide popularity among the toiling masses. George considered the people's woes as originating basically from the private monopolization of the land, and his main social remedy was to tax this monopoly out of existence. This was the single tax. George failed to note, however, as Engels and the SLP leaders sharply pointed out, that the main cause of the workers' poverty and the antagonism of classes was the capitalists' ownership of all the social means of production, and that, therefore, the final solution, as the socialists proposed, could only be had through the collective ownership by society of all these means of production. George did not understand the capitalist class as the basic enemy of the working class and the people. In his election platform, however, he included demands for government ownership of the telegraph and railroads, as well as some minor labor planks. Henry George was nominated by the local trade union movement in New York. The SLP also endorsed his candidacy as a struggle of labor against capital, not because of his single tax theory, but in spite of it. While basically criticizing the single tax, Engels, who paid close attention to American labor developments, agreed that the socialists should offer Henry George qualified support. The main thing, he said, was that the masses of workers were taking important first steps in independent political action. The bitterly contested local campaign resulted in votes as follows. Abram S. Hewitt, 90,456. Henry George, 67,930. Theodore Roosevelt, 60,474. The George forces claimed with justification that they had been counted out. Following the New York elections, the socialists and the George forces split over the question of program and the single tax movement, torn with dissension, soon petered out. The status of the SLP. In 1890. In the aftermath of the tremendous class struggles, beginning with the big national railroad strike of 1877, which climaxed in the 8-hour fight of 1886, the SLP, although still weakened by internal confusion and dissension, began to grow. At its 7th convention, in 1889, the party claimed to have 70 sections, as against 32 at its convention of 2 years before. The party press was also looking up. The party, however, was far from having developed a solid Marxist program and leadership. As yet, those who could actually be called Marxists were very few. Consequently, the party, while abiding by its ultimate goal of socialism and using the writings of Marx and Engels as its guide, was wafted hither and yon by the pressures of the current class struggle. Still torn with division, the party had, in its 14 years of life so far, developed various ideological deviations, most of which were to plague the socialist movement for years to come. There were the Rights, who had dominated the party's leadership since its foundation in 1876. They underestimated the importance of trade unionism, made opportunistic deals with greenbackers and other movements, yielded to Chinese exclusionist sentiment, catered to the skilled workers, and generally played down the leading role of the party. Then there were the sectarian lefts, who wanted to cast aside the ballot as a delusion, refused to participate in broad labor and farmer movements, toyed with dual unionism, and satisfied themselves with mere propaganda of revolutionary slogans. There were also the direct actionists, anarcho-syndicalists who, as we have just seen, had nearly wrecked the party. And finally, on the part of all these groupings, there was a deep misunderstanding and neglect of the vital Negro question. Marx, and especially Engels, gave direct advice to the American socialist movement during the 70s and 80s, fighting against all the characteristic deviations. These two great leaders sought tirelessly to break the isolation of the socialists from the broad masses, urging their active participation in all the elementary movements of the working class and its allies, in the trade unions, the labor parties, and the farmer movements. But the great Marx died in 1883, and Engels followed him a dozen years later in 1895. Thus the young American proletariat lost its two most brilliant and devoted teachers and leaders. One of the most serious handicaps of the SLP during this whole period was its almost exclusive German composition. The publication of Lawrence Gr. 6 Enland's Cooperative Commonwealth in 1884, and Edward Bellamy's famous Looking Backward in 1888, helped to popularize socialist and semi-socialist ideas among the American masses, but Justice Ebert could still say, the Socialist Labor Party of the 80s was a German party and its official language was German. The American element was largely incidental. And Lawrence Grainland also said that in 1881 could count the native-born socialists on one hand. Engels spoke of the German-American Socialist Labor Party, and he fought to improve its isolated situation. In a letter to Florence Kelley Wisniewski, he said of the SLP, "This party is called on to play a very important part in the movement. But in order to do so they will have to doff every remnant of their foreign garb. They will have underscore to become out and out American. They cannot expect the Americans to come to them. They, the minority, and the immigrants, must go to the Americans who are the vast majority and the natives. And to do that, they must above all things learn English." In 1889, the internal dissensions within the SLP reached a breaking point. The opposition to the opportunist leadership, according to Ebert, turned around three major points. First, its compromising political policy. Second, its stronger pure and simple trade union tendencies. Third, its German spirit and forms. The revolt was led by the New York Volkszeitung, Shevich Jonas Group, founded in 1878 as a German daily paper. The Bush-Rosenberg official leaders of the party, a hangover from the old opportunist Van Patten Group, were deposed and the Shevich Jonas faction elected instead. This led to a split, and in consequence for a while there were two SLPs. The Rosenberg Group, the minority faction, got the worst of the struggle. It lingered along weakly, calling itself the Social Democratic Federation, until finally it fused in 1897 with Debs Social Democracy. Lucien Sanyal wrote the new program of the SLP. The split strengthened the Marxist elements in the party. The SLP of today dates its foundation from this period. In the following year, 1890, an event of major importance to the SLP and the labor movement took place. This was the entrance of Daniel de Leon into the party. De Leon, born in 1852 on the island of Curagoa off the coast of Venezuela, was a professor of international law at Columbia University, and had supported Henry George in the 1886 campaign. Brilliant, energetic, and ruthless, de Leon immediately became a power in the SLP. In 1891 he secured the post as editor of the Weekly People, later a daily, which he held from then on. For the next 30 years, long after his death in 1914, de Leon's writings were to exert a profound influence not only upon the SLP, but upon the whole left wing, right down to the formation of the Communist Party in 19,109, and even beyond. 6. The SLP. De Leonism in decline, 1890 to 1900. During the period from the mid-80s to the end of the century, American industrial development proceeded at an unheard of pace. The United States, wrote Lenin in 1913, is unequaled in the rapidity of development of capitalism at the end of the IGTH and the beginning of the 20th century. In these years the United States leapt from fourth to first place as an industrial nation, leaving England, the workshop of the world, far behind. Kaczynski says that the United States, in 1894, was turning out, in value of manufactures, over twice as much as England. Meanwhile, as American industry expanded it also became monopolized. In 1901, J. Moody listed a total of 440 large industrial, financial, and franchise trusts, with a total capital of over $20 billion, United States Steel, Standard Oil, and many other great trusts in railroad, sugar, coal, etc., date from this period. Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn, Loeb, and others were already huge concerns by the end of the century. A great financial oligarchy, ruthlessly ruling the country, had grown up. This was a time of the fiercest competition, and particularly during the economic crises of 1885 and 1893 the big capitalist beasts devoured thousands of the smaller ones. The middle classes were being ground down, nor could the Sherman Antitrust Law of 1890 save them. The workers were barbarously exploited and slaughtered in the industries. The United States had become a powerful imperialist country. With its home market now assured, monopoly reached out for foreign conquests. The arrogant Wall Street monopolists, dominating the industries and the government, transformed the Monroe Doctrine into an instrument for the subjugation and exploitation of Latin America. By 1893, they had also virtually annexed the Hawaiian Islands, on the route of conquest across the Pacific. In 1898, under the pretext of freeing Cuba, they provoked a war with Spain, with the result that the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba fell into the hands of the United States. Flushed with imperialist ambition, Senator Lodge declared, the 78 history of the Communist Party. American people and the economic forces which underlie all are carrying us forward to the economic supremacy of the world. Fierce labor struggles. The 18 grams zeros were a period of great labor struggles, exceeding in intensity and scope even those of the two previous decades. The working class, more and more employed in large enterprises, had grown very greatly in size. The arrogant capitalists, resolved to strip their wage slaves of every trade union defense and to subject them to the most intense exploitation humanly possible, met with extreme violence all resistance on the part of the workers to their imperious will. But they encountered a working class rapidly growing in numbers, understanding, and organization, and the hardest fought strikes in our nation's history developed. One of the most desperate of these was the Great Homestead, Pennsylvania, strike of July 1892. The strike was directed against the Carnegie Steel Company by the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers, to prevent an announced wage cut. The company brought in Pinkerton detective gunmen to break the strike, but the armed workers drove them out and occupied the plants. Finally, however, the strike was broken, and a mortal blow was dealt to trade unionism throughout the trustified steel industry. In the metal mining country of the Rocky Mountain states, at the same time, there developed a whole series of strikes, in Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. These reached the pitch of actual civil war, with armed encounters between strikers and troops. Many were killed on each side. These historic strikes, led by Bill Haywood, Vincent Street, John, and other radicals, laid the basis for the famous Western Federation of Miners. In this decade, many important strikes also took place on the railroads. They culminated in the historic strike, beginning in May 1894, of the American Railway Union. This organization, which was industrial in form and a rival of the conservative railroad craft unions, was headed by Eugene V. Debs, who was not yet a socialist. The strike began in the Pullman shops in Chicago against a wage reduction. It developed into a general strike on the railroads, with more than 100,000 workers out and many western roads tied up. The big strike was finally broken by the company's and government's use of scabs, troops, court injunctions, and the wholesale arrest of the strike leaders, including Debs. Another big strike of this period was that of the coal miners, beginning in May 1893. Some 125,000 struck. The strike was broken, nevertheless the United Mine Workers virtually established itself as a solid union during this strike. Still another important workers' movement was the March of the Unemployed to Washington in the hard times of 1894, led by General Jacob S. Coxey, a well-to-do businessman. In the final decade of the century, the Knights of Labor faded out and the American Federation of Labor became the dominant organization, slowly increasing its membership to 548,321 in 1900. The role of De Leon. The SLP bore heavy political responsibilities of leadership in the 18 zeros, faced as it was by rapidly developing American monopoly capitalism and by the intensely sharpening class struggle. If the party was to function effectively and to grow, it had to serve as the vanguard of the whole labor movement. This required that it should not only educate the workers regarding the final goal of socialism, but, imperatively, that it also give them practical leadership in all their daily struggles. But this mass guidance the SLP, under the leadership of Daniel De Leon, proved quite unable to provide. De Leon made strong pretensions of being a Marxist, but until the day of his death in May 1914, he never succeeded in really becoming one. De Leon formally accepted such basic Marxist concepts as historical materialism, Marxist economics, and the class struggle. He also circulated the Marxist classics, knew the importance of industrial unionism, and was an advocate of a strong, centralized party. And above all, De Leon was a relentless fighter against right opportunism, his attacks against the right-wing Social Democrats and against the reactionary leadership of the trade unions being classics of polemics. Nevertheless, De Leon's position was fundamentally revisionist, as he rewrote Marx in many important essentials. His general outlook was a mixture of left, sectarianism and syndicalism. He was essentially a left petty bourgeois radical. De Leon, for example, had a non-Marxist, syndicalist conception of the future socialist society. Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, pointed out the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which, as we see in the Soviet Union and the people's democracies of Eastern Europe, implies the establishment of a workers' government in the interim period of socialism, between capitalism and communism. The function of this government is to act as an organ to repress the defeated, counter-revolutionary capitalist class, to build the new society, and to defend the country from foreign imperialist attacks. But De Leon never realized these facts. 80. History of the Communist Party syndicalists, * that the industrial unions would be the basis of the future society. This industrial organization, according to De Leon, would not be a state, with coercive powers, but simply an administrative apparatus. In this respect, De Leon's conceptions were in basic harmony with those of the IWW syndicalists from 1905 on. De Leon said, "Industrial unionism is the socialist republic in the making, and the goal once reached, the industrial union is the socialist republic in operation." He subscribed to the IWW preamble, which declared that, by organizing industrially, we are forming the structure of the new society within the shell of the old. And he definitely declared, "Where the General Executive Board of the Industrial Workers of the World will sit, there will sit the nation's capital." After the Russian Revolution, the SLP leaders claimed that de Leon, with his concept of an industrial republic, had forecast the Soviet system, and that Lenin had congratulated him for so doing. But this was nonsense. De Leon's ideas of the structure of socialist society were rooted in anarchist and left sectarian, not Marxist, sources. Significantly, de Leon's present-day followers, who rigidly cling to his ideas, have repudiated the whole organization of the Soviets. De Leon also diverged widely from Marxism in his conception of how the revolution was to be brought about in the United States. He saw this in the sense of the workers taking over society in the face of a virtually unresisting capitalist class. It is a fact, of course, that Marx, long before, had made an exception of England and the United States in his generalization that the resistance of the capitalists to social progress would necessarily make the socialist revolution violent in character. In this respect, he said that, if, for example, the working class in England and the United States should win a majority in Parliament, in Congress, it could legally abolish those laws and institutions which obstruct its development. Marx qualified this with an if. That is, if the capitalists did not resist the legal transfer of power. Lenin later showed that the advance of imperialism in these two countries, by creating a big army and state bureaucracy, had changed this. The workers, true to their democratic instincts, would seek to make a peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, but they would have to face and defeat the capitalists' attempts to block them by violence. One see the program of the Anarcho-Syndicalist International Working People's Association in Chapter 3. De Leon, however, ignored these political changes in the United States and their consequences upon the ultimate fight for socialism. He elaborated his opportunist idea that the party would peacefully win a majority at the polls and then, the party's political function finished, it would at once dissolve, whereupon, the industrial unions would take and hold the industries, locking out the capitalists. In the unlikely event that the latter would violently resist, the industrial unions, although simply an administrative apparatus, would take care of them. De Leon had little conception of the leading role of the party. His whole stress was upon the industrial unions before, during, and after the revolution. In his thinking they played the decisive role at all stages. Nor did he have any conception of party democracy and discipline. He ruthlessly expelled all those who in any jot or tittle diverged from his dogmatism. De Leon likewise deviated widely from Marxism on a whole series of vital questions of strategy and tactics. He had no conception of the farmers, middle class, and Negro people as natural allies of the working class. He rejected the Labor Party on principle, made no effort whatever to rally the Negro masses, withdrew from all farmer movements, and sneered at the fight of the middle classes against the trusts. De Leon also had an almost solicitous regard for trusts as a basically progressive development. He stated, "We say, even if the trust could be smashed, we would not smash it, because by smashing it, we would throw civilization back." This schematic attitude sufficed to cut the SLP off from the mass struggle, healthy but not always skillfully waged, against the advance of ruthless monopoly capital. This wrong attitude toward the trusts also prevailed in the Socialist Party for many years, the latter dovetailing it with the slogan, "Let the nation own the trusts." Such sectarian trends sharply isolated the SLP from all the elementary popular mass movements of the working people. To make this isolation doubly sure, de Leon also condemned on principle the fight for all immediate demands, which he characterized as banana peels under the feet of the workers. Starting out with an acceptance of Henry George's wholly opportunistic program, de Leon wound up by rejecting partial demands altogether. Eventually he slashed the program of the SLP to but one single demand, the unconditional surrender of the capitalist class. The trend of de Leonism was to reduce the party to an isolated, sectarian, dogmatic body, propagating socialism in the abstract, as the SLP continues to do to this very day. In 1891, when de Leon took the helm. 82. History of the Communist Party. Of the party, there were no Marxists able to challenge effectively his sectarian vagaries. Marx was dead, Engels was to die before de Leon got well going, the aged Sorge was no longer active, MacDonald had long since given up the work in the SLP, and the other Marxists, such as Sanyal and Vogt, quickly fell under the spell of de Leon's brilliance. The tragedy of it all was that de Leonite thinking came to dominate the whole left wing for many years. Indeed, it was not until the advent of the stern realities of the Russian Revolution, the arrival in America of the profound Marxist writings of Lenin, and the formation of the Communist Party, a generation later, that the ideological influence of de Leon was finally broken. The SLP and the trade unions. By the 1890s, the big capitalists of the United States had definitely launched upon a policy of hamstringing the fighting capacity of the working class by cultivating a labor aristocracy of better paid, native-born, skilled workers. This they did at the expense of the unskilled and Negro workers. With the many advantages enjoyed by capitalism in this country, the capitalists had the financial reserves to carry out this policy of labor corruption to an extent far beyond anything ever achieved by the employers of Great Britain or any other capitalist country. The opportunist leaders of the AFL went right along with this general plan, with their bitter anti-socialism, class collaborationism, opposition to a labor party, craft unionism, exclusion of Negroes and unskilled, and strike betrayals. De Leon militantly attacked this official corruption, assailing the Gompers bureaucrats as labor lieutenants of the capitalist class. But the general conclusion he drew from his analysis was wrong. Namely, that the socialists should withdraw from the old, conservative-led trade unions and devote themselves to building a professedly socialist labor movement. The effect of this policy was to leave the old unions in the hands of the reactionaries and to isolate the socialists from these basic economic organizations of the working class. De Leon heaped his greatest scorn upon those who advocated the improvement of the conservative unions by boring from within. De Leon's dualist line went directly counter to the advice of Engels, who definitely favored working within the old unions. Already in 1887, warning against such isolating tendencies as De Leon's, Engels declared, "I think that all our practice has shown that it is possible to work along 83 with the general movement of the working class at every one of its stages without giving up or hiding our own distinct position, and even organization, and I am afraid that if the German Americans choose a different line they will commit a great mistake." The De Leon leadership in 1890 split with the AFL over the well-known Sanyal case. The SLP, with only a vague idea of the dividing line between party and trade union, had its American section affiliate with the Independent Central Labor Federation of New York, which the socialists led. Hence, when this body applied to the AFL for a charter, its delegate, Lucian Sanyal, was rejected by Gompers on the grounds that the AFL did not accept the affiliation of political parties. After a bitter fight, the 1890 AFL convention in Detroit sustained Gompers' contention by a vote of 1699 to 535. Both Engels and Sorge later declared that Gompers was formally right in this issue, but De Leon seized upon the quarrel to drive a deep wedge between the SLP and the AFL and to reduce greatly the socialist work done in that organization. The New York Central Labor Federation remained independent. De Leon next turned his attention to the Knights of Labor, then definitely on the decline. He joined Mixed Assembly 1563 and had himself elected a delegate from this local to District Assembly No. 49 of New York, which the socialists controlled. From this body De Leon was sent as a delegate to the 1893 General Assembly of the KFL. There the socialist delegates were chiefly responsible for defeating the reactionary Powderly and for electing J.R. Sovereign as master workman in his stead. Sovereign promised to make Lucian Sanyal editor of the Orders Journal, but he later backed down on this agreement. Relations between Sovereign and the SLP leaders therefore grew very strained. So that at the 189% General Assembly of the KFL in Washington, De Leon was refused a seat as a delegate. This experience finally sickened De Leon with work inside the old unions in general. Henceforth, he was as violently opposed to participation in the KFL as he was to work within the AFL. Consequently, he had the socialists, including District No. 49, also withdraw from the KFL, as he had done from the AFL. Then he proceeded to organize a new socialist labor movement, one after his own liking, the Socialist Trades and Labor Alliance. Significantly, Debs, with similar sectarian reasoning, had preceded De Leon by 2 years by founding the Industrial Union, the ARU, in competition with all the railroad craft unions. The Socialist Trades and Labor Alliance. The STLA was organized by De Leon without formal consultation with the party. He simply called a conference of the heads of the independent New York Central Labor Federation, the United Hebrew Trades, the Newark Central Labor Federation, and the seceded District Assembly No. 49, decided on a new organization, and launched the STLA on December 13, 1895, at a mass meeting in Cooper Union. De Leon assured the doubting SLP National Executive Committee that the STLA would not be a rival to the AFL, but would confine itself to organizing the unorganized. Experience quickly proved otherwise, however, and soon the new organization was in death grips with the old unions. Opposition to the STLA began to mount also among SLP trade unionists, but De Leon nevertheless managed to have the new organization endorsed at the party's 1896 convention in New York, by a vote of 71 to 6. In 1898 the STLA claimed, excessively, to have 15,000 members. In reality it stagnated, incapable of growth. An auxiliary of the SLP, committed to support SLP candidates in elections, and generally tied to De Leon's dogmas, the new General Union could not attract the masses. It conducted a few minor strikes, and that was all. 10 years after its foundation, the STLA, in 1905, fused with other left-wing unions informing the industrial workers of the world. At this convention de Leon claimed to represent 1,500 members in the STLA, but even this was an exaggerated figure. Meanwhile, the AFL, which de Leon had long ago pronounced deader than dead, continued to grow, expanding from 260,000 in 1895 to 1,480,000 in 1905. One of the chief results of the STLA was to create what turned out to be a fatal schism between the party's trade unionists and the de Leon leadership. The dual organization, by pulling many militants out of the AFL unions, greatly weakened the socialist forces in these bodies, and also their participation in the big strikes of the period. In the 1893 AFL convention in Chicago, the socialist delegation, led by Thomas J. Morgan, had succeeded in getting through a 12-point resolution including the collective ownership by the people of all means of production and distribution. The latter plank was later defeated in a referendum. In the 1894 convention, the socialists succeeded in defeating Gompers and electing as president for the ensuing year the conservative John McBride of the Miners' Union. ISDS also had a resolution on the Negro question adopted, stating, the AFL does not draw the color line, nor do its affiliates. A union that does cannot be admitted into affiliation with this body. In these formative years of the AFL, a correct Marxist policy could have changed very considerably in a progressive direction the future history of that organization. But such dual unionism as that of the STLA, which in various forms was to plague the Marxists for 25 years after 1895, effectively crippled the left wing in the trade unions and facilitated the consolidation of the reactionary Gompers leadership. Labor Party and populist movement. Traditionally, the Marxists in the United States, whatever their mistakes in applying this policy, had followed the basically correct line of participating in the many mass labor and farmer parties set up by the workers during more than 2 generations of class struggle. But de Leon proceeded to make ducks and drakes of this policy and to separate the Marxists from these mass political activities, even as he had largely cut them off from the mass trade unions. He declared against the Labor Party in principle, and condemned the farmer movement out of hand, plumping for direct support of the sectarian SLP politically under all circumstances. This narrow line was directly contrary to the one carefully promulgated over many years by Engels. Thus, in connection with the big political movements of the 1880s, the latter wrote that, "A million or two of workingmen's votes next November for a bona fide workingmen's party is worth infinitely more at present than 100,000 votes for a doctrinally perfect platform." And again, he said, "The first great step of importance for every country newly entering into the movement is always the organization of the workers as an independent political party, no matter how, so long as it is a distinct workers' party." De Leon also had a narrow policy regarding the farmers. During the 18 grams zeros, the farmers' grievances came to a head in the populist movement. This struggle grew out of capitalist pressure against the farmers, in the shape of usurious mortgages, gouging freight rates, excessive prices for what the farmers had to buy, and minimum prices for what they had to sell. Droughts and hard times helped to fill the farmers' cup of misery to overflowing. The farmers' movement had roots running far back through a long 86 history of the Communist Party series of struggles of the Grangers, Greenbackers, and other agrarian organizations. The People's Party was organized in St. Louis on February 22, 1892. Its program called for government ownership of the telegraphs and railroads, government reclamation of the land, and a number of minor labor demands. In the 1892 elections, the Populist Party's candidate, General Weaver, polled 1,027,329 votes. In 1894, a crisis year, the party's vote went up to 1,523,979. In 1896, however, following an ill-fated fusion with the Democratic Party behind William Jennings Bryan, the vote fell to but 200,000, and the People's Party was dead. It had been led to destruction by opportunists. Organized labor did not fully support this big farmers' populist movement. This was a major reason why it collapsed. In its 1892 and 1896 conventions, the United Mine Workers and the Declining Knights of Labor were represented, but the Gompers Group, already committed to the two-party system, kept the American Federation of Labor from participating. Under de Leon's prodding, the Socialist Labor Party, at its convention in July 1893, sharply condemned the People's Party as antagonistic to the interests and aims of the proletariat. In 1892, the SLP nominated, for the first time, its own presidential candidates. Simon Wing, a small manufacturer, and Charles Matchett, an electrician. The ticket polled 21,534 votes in 6 eastern states. The party also put up candidates in 1896, Matchett and M. McGuire, who got 36,534 votes. De Leon's isolationist policy toward the spontaneous political movements of the workers and farmers did infinite harm to the party as well as to these mass movements. It remained the dominant policy not only of the Socialist Labor Party, but also of the Socialist Party, for a full 30 years, down to the 1920s. The SLP and the Negro. One of the greatest weaknesses throughout the history of the Socialist Labor Party was its incorrect position on the Negro question. It is a fact that ever since the Civil War, and even before it, the Marxists fought resolutely to include the Negro workers in the trade unions and to defend their economic interests. But they did not understand the Negro question as a developing national question, and they did not work out a full program of demands for the Negro people. Nor did they realize the true significance of the broad political demands raised by the Negro people themselves. This misunderstanding was particularly a handicap to the Negro masses during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, when the urgent need for working-class support was most vital in their fight for land and freedom. De Leon did nothing to clear up the weakness and confusion of the Marxists on the Negro question. On the contrary, he intensified it. After the Civil War, the newly emancipated Negro people, under heavy economic and political pressures, began to develop toward becoming a nation. This development has continued down to our years. De Leon, who claimed to be the leading Marxist theoretician in this country, had no inkling whatever of this basic development, even in its most elementary aspects. In fact, he virtually ignored the burning Negro question altogether. His writings are almost bare of references to the struggles and hardships of the Negro people, although the news dispatches of the times were full of reports of barbarous lynchings of Negroes, and the Negro people were being outrageously discriminated against politically, economically, and socially all over the country. Behind such gross neglect, as in the case of many later socialist and trade union leaders, lurked the corroding disease of white chauvinism. White chauvinism, the bourgeois ideology of white supremacy, is based upon the false notion that Negroes are inferior beings to whites. It is systematic discrimination and persecution directed against the Negro people economically, politically, socially. Although completely disproved innumerable times scientifically and in the real life of our people, it still persists. This is because the planters and industrialists, finding that it enables them to force lower living standards upon the Negro people, assiduously cultivate it. Originally the plantation owner's ideological justification for slavery, white chauvinism still infects in varying degrees all the strata of the white population, including large sections of the working class. What little De Leon did write on the Negro question was incorrect. He reduced it all only to a class issue. The Negro constitutes, he said, a special division in the ranks of labor. In no economic respect is he different from his fellow wage slaves of other races. Yet by reason of his race, which long was identified with serfdom, the rays of the social question reached his mind, through such broken prisms that they are refracted into all the colors of the rainbow, preventing him from appreciating the white light of the question. The only program that De Leon had for the bitterly persecuted Negro people was eventual socialism. He saw no need to raise immediate demands to relieve the barbarous persecution to which they were being subjected. This basically incorrect attitude, as formulated by De Leon. 88. History of the Communist Party became for many years the settled socialist theoretical and practical approach to the Negro question, not only by rights, but also largely by lefts. It was not until after the advent of the Communist Party, a generation later, that the immense importance of the struggle of the Negro people to the socialist movement in general was fully realized, that its nature as a national question came to be understood, and that correct Marxist policies were formulated to meet it. The decline of the Socialist Labor Party. In 1900, after 24 years of existence, the SLP had not more than 5,000 or 6,000 members. In 26 states. The party's national vote had advanced to 82,204. The great preponderance of the membership was foreign-born, German, Jewish, Scandinavian, Polish, etc. The party was largely isolated from the mass organizations and struggles of the toiling masses. Obviously, this was not the picture of a prospering vanguard party of the working class. Undoubtedly, adverse objective conditions were in large part responsible for the SLP's failure to grow, a question discussed in Chapter 37. Even with the most correct of policies, under the circumstances of the time, it would have been difficult to build a strong Marxist party in a capitalist country such as the United States. Nevertheless, there were far greater opportunities for increasing the party's numbers and influence than the SLP was able to realize. This failure was largely due to De Leon's grave sectarian political errors. His withdrawal from the conservative trade unions, his anti-labor party, anti-Negro, and anti-farmer movement policies, and his abandonment of all immediate demands, all of which became the party line, had particularly disastrous consequences for the party during the big economic and political struggles of the 1890s. That the SLP under De Leon was unable to unite and give leadership to the Marxists of the country was also graphically demonstrated by the growth, during De Leon's period, of a whole series of socialist and near-socialist tendencies outside the control of the official De Leon leadership. Among these were the Debs movement in the Middle West, the radical socialist group of Haywood and others among the miners of the Rocky Mountain states, the left and radical elements in the disintegrating populist movement, and the crystallization of an opposition group within the SLP itself. The SLP under de Leon's sectarian, dogmatic leadership was also quite incapable of learning from its mistakes. Consequently, it could not reorient itself to draw into its ranks the new socialist forces, nor meet the new and pressing problems being thrust upon it by developing American imperialism. In short, it had exhausted its role as the Socialist Party of the American proletariat. Hence it began to disintegrate and to split, in the first stage of being overwhelmed by the new socialist forces and of being supplanted by a new organization, the Socialist Party. DHS split in Chess, L.P. The split movement began over the question of the STLA, but it soon involved the whole sectarian, authoritarian regime of de Leon. Almost immediately after the founding of the new General Union, the trade unionists in the party had begun to line up against it. De Leon tried to stifle the growing discontent with a policy of repressions and expulsions. In December 1898, however, the Volkszeitung, taking an opposition stand, made so bold as to criticize openly the party policy. This brought about a sharp factional battle between the de Leonites and the dissidents. Among the Volkszeitung movement's leaders was Morris Hillquit. Born in Riga in 1870, Hillquit had come to America when he was 15 years old and worked at shirtmaking and other trades. At one time he was secretary of the United Hebrew Trades. He acquired a degree in law in 1893. As a member of the SLP, Hillquit took an active part in the anti-de Leon struggle. The bitter party fight came to a climax on July 10, 1899, when Section New York, which by a decision of the Convention of 1896 had the authority to elect the National Executive Committee and the National Secretary of the SLP, voted to remove the officials then in office and elected a new set. Thus, Henry L. Slobodin became the National Secretary, in place of Henry Kuhn. De Leon refused to recognize this action, denouncing the rebels as kangaroos. A physical struggle ensued for possession of the party's buildings, newspapers, and funds. Both groups claimed to be the Socialist Labor Party and each published its own The People. Eventually the courts ruled that the de Leon faction had the legal right to use the party name. In the meantime, the seceding group, still calling itself the SLP, held a convention in Rochester on January 1, 1900. Present were 59 delegates, representing about half of the party's membership. The convention promptly condemned the STLA, drafted a new platform, enacted a new set of bylaws for governing the party, and put up 90. History of the Communist Party presidential candidates for the coming elections, Job Harriman and Max Hayes. The convention also adopted a resolution proposing fusion with the Social Democratic Party, of which Debs and Victor Berger were the leaders. The split was irretrievably disastrous to the old SLP. Its membership fell off to about one-half, and its candidates in the 1900 elections, James T. Maloney and Valentine Remmel, polled only 34,191 votes, or less than half the party's vote in 1898. De Leon, no longer facing any opposition at the 1900 convention, promptly cut out the tapeworm of immediate demands from the party's platform and left it with but one plank, a demand for the revolution. The SLP convention also adopted a resolution prohibiting its members, on pain of expulsion, from becoming officers in old-line trade unions. The SLP, having lost the leadership of the Marxist movement in the United States, was now fully on the way to becoming the tiny, dry as dust, backward-looking, reactionary sect that it is today. De Leonism in the SLP had arrived at its logical goal. But unfortunately de Leon's sectarian influence was long to linger in left-wing circles in the United States. 7. The Socialist Party, 1900 to 1905. At its foundation in 1901, the Socialist Party, which was eventually to give birth to the Communist Party, confronted a powerful and triumphant capitalist system in the United States. From 1860 to 1900, the value of manufactured products had leapt up from $1,885,825,000 to $11,406,927,000. The amount of capital invested rose from $1,000, 8% $6,000 to $8,975,256,000. The number of workers in industry increased from 1,310,000 to 4,713,000 and 14 million immigrants had poured into the country. The population grew during these 4 decades from 31,443,321 to 75,994,575. i.e. United States had been transformed from a predominantly agricultural country into the leading industrial nation in the world. Its tempo of development was to go right on through the period we are here discussing. American capitalism, at the turn of IHE century, had definitely entered the stage of imperialism, as scientifically defined by Lenin. Its industries had acquired a high degree of monopoly, its financial system had become dominated by a few large banks. Its big industrialists and bankers had fused into an oligarchy of finance capital which dominated the state. It was already a decisive factor in dividing up the world's markets, and it had, in the Spanish-American War, begun its grab for its imperialistic share of the world's territories. The agrarian country of Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln had become the monopolist, imperialist land of the Morgans and the Rockefellers. The big capitalists, in forging their way ahead to solid class domination of the United States, had slugged the workers, farmers, and middle classes in many hard-fought political battles since the Civil War, as we have seen, and they controlled the government from stem to gudgeon. In 1900, under the leadership of Bryan, the Democratic candidate, and with their main slogan directed against American imperialism, the farmers and small business elements made another bid for power. But to no avail. The Republican candidate of Wall Street, William McKinley, won handily. And when the new president was assassinated in Buffalo, on September 6, 1901, by Leon F. Czolgosz, an anarchist, he was succeeded by the ultra-jingoist and imperialist, Theodore Roosevelt. 92. History of the Communist Party. Corruption of the A.F.L. leadership. Toward the workers, the arrogant employers followed a two-phased policy of repression, on the one hand, violently combating every attempt at labor organization and struggle, and on the other hand, making minor wage concessions to the skilled workers in order to use them as a means to paralyze the struggles and to keep down the wages of the mass of the working class. The many bloody strikes of this general period and the extreme corruption of the AFL leaders were eloquent testimonials to the vigor with which the employers followed this labor-crushing policy. By 1900, the top AFL leadership, ardent supporters of capitalism, had become thoroughly corrupted, politically and personally. They had accepted as their basis the employer policy, which became more and more marked as the imperialist era developed, of bribing the skilled workers at the expense of the semi-skilled and unskilled. They were indeed what De Leon called them, labor lieutenants of the capitalists. The AFL leaders, in line with this policy, clung to their antique craft union system of having a dozen or more unions in each given industry, although the rise of the trusts and intense specialization of labor had rendered craft unionism obsolete. They fought desperately against every left-wing suggestion of industrial unionism, whether in the shape of new organizations or by the transformation of the old craft unions. Scores of lost strikes, in which habitually some of the unions would remain at work while the rest were striking, testified to the complete inadequacy of the craft form of organization and indicated the urgent need of the workers for industrial unionism. If the unions managed to register some growth during this period, it was in spite of the policies of their reactionary leaders and because of the desperate need of the workers to defend their living standards. The socialists militantly urged the foreign-born to unionize. Especially did the labor bureaucrats of the AFL and railroad brotherhoods, loyal to the basic interests of the bosses, stand guard against independent political action by the workers. In 1895, the AFL convention decided that party politics, whether they be Democratic, Republican, Socialistic, Populistic, Prohibitionist, or any other, would have no place in the convention of the American Federation of Labor. This policy, the Gompersites interpreted by making rabid attacks against the Socialist Party and by a solid resistance against all attempts to form a labor party. They developed a sort of economism American brand, having practically no labor political program whatever. At the same time, they were venal agents of the capitalist parties. With their slogan of "Reward your friends and punish your enemies," they kept the workers locked in the two-party system. All of which worked measureless harm to the political interests of the working class. Another keystone of AFL policy was to prevent the organization of the unskilled masses, especially the Negro workers, by keeping them out of the unions through high initiation fees, male white clauses, apprenticeship regulations, refusal to organize the basic industries, and various other devices. As for the Negro people as a whole, they were abandoned completely to the mercies of the employers, the plantation owners, and white supremacists generally. The essence of Gompersite policy was class collaboration, which meant class subordination of the workers to the capitalists. During the period from 1900 to World War I, this policy was symbolized as well as organized by the National Civic Federation. The NCF was established in Chicago in 1893, supposedly to bring about better relations between labor and capital. In 1900, under the guidance of Ralph M. Easley, it was broadened out onto a national scale. Employers, labor, and the public were separately represented on the leading committees of the Civic Federation. Senator Mark Hanna was chairman, Gompers was vice chairman, and among the representatives of the public were August Belmont, Grover Cleveland, and President Charles W. Eliot. John Mitchell, head of the Miners' Union, and many other labor leaders also became members. The Civic Federation set out to stifle every semblance of radicalism and life in the labor movement. The establishment of the Civic Federation, with the help of the Gomper's leadership was one phase of the employers' offensive against the working class, which took on added virulence after 1900. The other phase of the offensive was a big drive of many big employers' associations to establish the open shop, or more properly speaking, the anti-union shop. This union-smashing drive was backed up by the courts, which annulled one labor law after another and confronted every important body of strikers with drastic injunctions. The immediate impulse for all this capitalist reaction came from the fact that the unions, despite the Gomper's misleadership, were in a period of rapid growth, which carried them from 300,000 in 1898 to 1,676,200 in 1904. It was in the middle of this general situation of expanding capitalism and labor misleadership that the Socialist Party came into being in 1901. Its predecessor, the Socialist Labor Party, under the leadership 94. History of the Communist Party of de Leon, had signally failed to meet the new problems placed before the workers by the rise of imperialism. The main political fight of the most advanced sections of the workers, thenceforth for almost 20 years, was to be organized through the new Socialist Party. The foundation of the SP was another stage in the evolution of American Marxism, which was finally to produce the Communist Party. Formation of the Socialist Party saw, as we have already remarked, the seceding Hillquit faction of the SLP, at its January 1 G00 convention in Rochester, sent a proposal to the Social Democratic Party convention, proposing the fusion of the two groups. Eugene V. Debs, leader of this party, was born in 1855. A railroad worker for many years, he was formerly active in democratic and populist politics. He became interested in socialism under the tutelage of Victor L. Berger while he was serving 6 months in the Woodstock, Illinois, jail as a result of the American Railway Union strike of 1894. It was some time, however, before he was ready to take a definite stand for socialism. At the 1896 convention of the People's Party, 412 of the 1,300 delegates gave written pledges to Debs for his candidacy against that of Bryan. The latter was nominated, however, and Debs supported him in the election. In January 1897, Debs declared himself a socialist. In June 1897, at Chicago, the American Railway Union, now only a skeleton organization, dissolved itself into the Social Democracy of America, with Debs at the head. This party had a confused program, its principal aim being an impractical plan of colonization. The idea was to capture some western state at the poles and then to launch socialism within that area. This utopian scheme, however, soon bred an opposition inside the party, especially from the more socialistic elements. At the organization's first convention in June 1898 in Chicago, therefore, a split developed, the seceding minority creating a new body, the Social Democratic Party of America. This party, with a radical labor program, and with Theodore Debs, Eugene's brother, as national secretary, scored some local election successes in Massachusetts. At its first national convention, on March 6, 1900, it had an estimated membership of 5,000. The SDP convention delegates responded favorably to the proposals of the Hillquit group for amalgamation. Debs and others of the party leaders, however, were a bit shy. After complicated maneuverings by both sides, the two organizations finally agreed to put up a joint ticket in the 1900 presidential election. The candidates chosen were Debs of the SDP and Job Harriman of the SLP seceders. The ticket polled 97,730 votes, or triple the vote secured by the old SLP in the election. Unity between the two organizations, however, was not yet achieved. The leaders of both factions jockeyed for position, while the membership pressed for unification. Finally, on July 29, 1901, a joint convention assembled in Indianapolis. The total membership represented by all groups numbered approximately 10,000. Of the 125 delegates, 70 came from the Hillquit group, 47 from the Debs group, and 8 from smaller groups. It was the largest and most representative gathering of American socialists ever held up to that time. In addition to the Debs and Hillquit factions, there were representatives from the more or less independent socialist groups of Western metal miners, from the left wing of the Disintegrating Agrarian People's Party, and from grouplets of Christian socialists. 3/4 of the delegates were native-born. For the first time, there were Negro delegates, 3, at a socialist convention. The convention formally united the socialist movement. It adopted a constitution, worked out a platform, named the new organization the Socialist Party of America, established national headquarters in St. Louis, and elected Leon Greenbaum, a relatively unknown figure, as national secretary. Debs was the outstanding mass personality at the convention, with Hillquit and Berger the real political leaders. The Socialist Party program, The Unity Convention was pretty well agreed on the general aim of the party, which was broadly stated as conquering the powers of government and using them for the purpose of transforming the present system of private ownership of the means of production and distribution into collective ownership by the entire people. On specific issues, however, sharp divisions prevailed. Strong de Leonist influence was present. Nevertheless, the Hillquid-Berger forces wrote the bulk of the program. The SP Convention, like that of the SLP in the previous year, displayed little understanding of the general question of imperialism, notwithstanding the fact that Bryan, the Democratic candidate, made this, confusedly, the central issue of the campaign. Both Debs and de Leon had opposed the Spanish-American War, and the AF in its 1898 convention adopted a sharp resolution condemning the seizure of the Philippines and combating imperialism in general, but neither Debs 96 nor de Leon had a grasp upon the basic significance of imperialism. De Leon, and pretty much Debs also, looked upon imperialism as simply expansionism, as merely a quantitative growth of capitalism. The trusts, they both considered as a basically progressive development, about which nothing could or should be done in an opposition way. Said de Leon, the issue of imperialism, which seems to be a political question, is only an economic question, being based upon and part of the economic question, expansion. Thus, de Leon mechanically accepted the development of imperialism, even as he did the growth of the trusts. In both respects, his fatalistic attitude tended to cut the party off from those masses, who wanted to fight both the trusts and imperialism generally. In November 1898, an anti-imperialist league was founded in Chicago. Eventually it had some 500,000 members. It was essentially middle class, with leaders such as U.S. Senators Hoar and Pettigrew, Carl Schurz, Mark Twain, Finley Peter Dunn, and the big steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie. Samuel Gompers was a vice president of the organization, and Debs displayed some interest in it. There was a strong pro-Philippines independence sentiment among the Negro people, and this found widespread expression in the Negro press of the time. Generally, the tendency of the socialists in the 1900 campaign was to reply to Bryan's and other attacks upon American imperialism by intensifying their anti-capitalist agitation, without grasping the special tasks thrust upon them by the rise of imperialism. Not the fight against imperialist policies, but the fight to destroy capitalism itself, is the issue, cried the de Leonites. Both socialist parties in their current platforms completely misunderstood, underestimated, and ignored the entire question of imperialism. A sharp debate occurred in the Unity Convention over the question of immediate demands. The impossibilists, the incipient left wing, reflecting de Leon influence, insisted that all such demands should be kept out of the party's program, and that the party should confine itself to making propaganda for socialism. The possibilists, however, beat down this argument, and by a vote of 5,358 to 1,325 the convention decided to support a policy of partial demands. The party's platform, therefore, in addition to demands for public ownership of public utilities and the means of transportation and communication, included demands also for reduced hours and increased wages, social insurance, equal civil and political rights for men and women, and the initiative, referendum, and recall. The convention stated only generally its principles on the trade union question. It declared that both economic and political action were necessary to bring about socialism, and it also took the position that the formation of every trade union, no matter how small or how conservative it may be, will strengthen the power of the wage working class. No mention was made in the party's program, however, of the vital issue of industrial unionism. De Leonite influence was strong so far as the party's attitude toward farmers was concerned. But the convention could not come to a decision on what to do about the matter, so the whole question was postponed until the next convention. Also, no demands were made for Negro rights. A resolution was adopted, however, inviting Negro workers to join the party. This was the only resolution on the Negro question passed by the party for many years, in fact up to the time of World War I. The Unity Convention in Indianapolis revealed the political immaturity of the founders of the Socialist Party, by compounding many de Leonite weaknesses and by displaying various reformist tendencies. The Unity on the trade union question did not resolve existing basic differences on the matter, what with Hillquid leaning toward collaboration with Gompers, while Debs' tendency was toward dual unionism. In the main, the convention failed to hammer out sound political policies and tactics firmly grounded in Marxist principles. Nevertheless, the founding of the Socialist Party, by bringing the socialist movement into contact with broad masses, was a progressive development. It broke with the de Leonite sectarianism which was strangling the advanced working class movement. But the Socialist Party could not be the party of the new type, as later defined by Lenin, as it finally failed to meet the demands of the imperialist era into which it was born. The employers' open shop offensive. Meanwhile, led by the National Association of Manufacturers, the attack of the employers against the trade unions and the living standards of the workers went on ferociously. In 1901, 62,000 steelworkers, striking against the U.S. Steel Corporation were defeated and unionism was practically wiped out in the trust mills. During the same year, the national metal trades smashed a national strike of 58,000 machinists, knocking the union out of most of their big plants. From 1901 to 1904, a whole series of strikes and semi-civil wars raged in the Rocky Mountain mining regions, led and largely won by the militant Western Federation of Miners, headed by such fighters as Bill Haywood and Vincent Street. John. In 1902, the anthracite miners of Pennsylvania, organized in the United Mine Workers and led by the conservative John Mitchell, waged a long 98. History and mostly unsuccessful strike. 1 And in 1905 the Chicago Teamsters lost a strike of 5,000 men. Casualties: ZGO killed, 400 injured, 500 arrested. All these strikes were savagely fought by the employers, with every known strike-breaking weapon, troops, injunctions, scabs, gunmen, and all the rest. The AFL leadership, deeply corrupted by the employers, met the onslaught by laying every obstacle in the way of the workers' solidarity and militancy. The general result of the anti-strike drive was to weaken the craft unions gravely in the basic industries. Nevertheless, the unions managed to grow, from a total of 868,500 in 1900 to 2022, 0G0 in 1905, mostly in the building trades and the lighter, not yet trustified, industries. The arrogant employers also pushed their drive against the workers in the political field. NAM agents in 1902 defeated the 8-hour and anti-injunction bills before Congress. They also knocked out many local and congressional election candidates who showed sympathy toward labor. In IGO 3 there began, also, the celebrated Danbury Hatters case, which was eventually to outlaw sympathy strikes, boycotts, and the union label. Divided and misled, organized labor's political influence, nationally and in the various states, was down almost to the vanishing point. Socialist Party activity. The socialists, at least partially freed from the fetters of de Leon's crippling sectarianism, plunged into this maelstrom of class struggle. That is, the worker socialists, the growing left wing, did. They were active in all the strikes and union organizing campaigns of the period. Consequently, they became influential in many local unions, city labor councils, and international unions. They also carried their struggle into the AFL conventions, where the bureaucratic union leaders were a definite section of the employers' strike-breaking forces. In these years the socialist militants fought for independent political action, industrial unionism, the organization of the unorganized, a more effective strike strategy. They ran socialist candidates against the Gompers machine. In the AFL convention of 1902 in New Orleans, the socialist group introduced a resolution, calling upon the AFL to advise the working people to organize their economic and political power to secure for labor the full equivalent of its toil and the overthrow of the one. During this big strike, the notorious President Bear of the coal-carrying Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared that industrial relations would be regulated by the Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given control of the property interests of the country. The Independent, August 28, 1902. Wage system. After a prolonged and heated debate, the Gompersites defeated the resolution by the narrow margin of 4,899 to 4,171.2. Among the unions which supported the socialists' resolution were such important organizations as the miners, carpenters, and brewery workers. A similar political resolution, together with one on industrial unionism, were brought up in the 190 grams convention, but both were beaten by a margin. The Gompersites violently resisted every effort of Che Marxists to improve and modernize the craft unions. Their denunciations of socialism were as violent as those of the capitalists. Gompers himself, who only a few years before had freely expressed his sympathy for the First International, set the pace in this red baiting. At the 1903 convention of the AFL he delivered himself of his well-known denunciation of the socialists. Economically you are unsound, socially you are wrong, and industrially you are an impossibility. This feud between the AFL leadership and the socialists, which dated back to de Leon in the early 1890s, was to rage with greater or less intensity until the end of World War I. Many petty bourgeois intellectuals in the SP looked askance at the struggle against the corrupt and reactionary AFL leadership. They figured that it interfered with their vote-getting activities. Their reformism, in fact, was the same in substance as that of the AFL bureaucracy, arising out of the corruption of the labor aristocracy by imperialism. Gomper's bitter fight against socialism was directed basically against the left wing, the sequel showing that he had no real quarrel with the middle-class intellectuals. Already Hillquit and his fellow opportunists were developing their policy of neutrality toward the trade unions. A correct Marxist policy signified working in the unions in order to strengthen them, to defend the rights of the workers, and to develop their class consciousness in the direction of socialism. The opportunist, neutrality, policy, on the contrary, meant no struggle. That is, allowing the workers to be influenced by the ideas of the bourgeoisie and dropping all fight against the corrupt. Gompers misleaders. Consequently, with the latter line in mind, at the 1904 convention of the AFL, no general socialist resolution was introduced. Max Hayes, a printer and prominent socialist unionist, declared that the socialists had come to realize that socialism would win not by passing resolutions, but by agitation. The Industrial Workers of the World was founded in Chicago on June 27, 1905. Present at the convention were 203 delegates, representing an estimated 142,991 members, of whom about 50,000 actually joined the new organization. There were 16 local and national AFL unions in attendance, but the main constituent bodies were the Western Federation of Miners, 27,000, American Labor Union, 16,750, United Metal Workers, 3,000, United Brotherhood of Railway Employees, 2,087, and the Socialist Trades and Labor Alliance, 1,450. C.O. Sherman of the United Metal Workers was selected general president. The purpose of the new organization was to re-establish the labor movement on a new socialist basis. Its form was the Industrial Union, its method was militant struggle in both the economic and political fields, and its goal was the abolition of the capitalist system. The 1WW was left-wing dual unionism. It was a militant answer of the workers to the stupidities and treacheries of Gompersite trade unionism, with its major concentration upon the skilled and betrayal of the unskilled. Its craft unionism and union scabbing in an industry that had become highly trustified, where the skilled craftsman played less and less a role and where worker solidarity had become imperative. Its overpaid and financially crooked officials. Its vicious practices of class collaboration, its corrupt alliances with the Republican and Democratic parties, and its worshipping at the shrine of the capitalist system. The fundamental mistake of dual unionism, however, was that by withdrawing the most advanced elements of the trade unions into ineffective competitive unions, the basic mass unions in the AFL were left in the virtually uncontested control of the corrupt Gompers machine. The IWW at its inception was a socialist union, the creation of the left wing of the SP. All its chief founders called themselves Marxists. Debs, De Leon and Haywood, the three outstanding left-wingers of the period, shook hands over the bloody chasm of past quarrels in setting up the organization. The anarchists and other direct actionists were but a negligible factor at the initial stage. The immediate impulse for forming the IWW came from the metal miners of the West. The Western Federation of Miners, born in fierce struggle, had been organized in 1893 in Butte. Receiving no support from the AFL, however, this union became independent. In May 1898, it established the Western Labor Union, the aim of which was to organize generally the workers of the Rocky Mountain areas. In 1GO2, the WLU reorganized itself into the American Labor Union, with the idea of one day superseding the whole AFL. It was a national dual union. The ALU had a socialist leadership, and both Haywood and Debs were active in its formation. It was in following out this general line of independent socialist unionism that the ALU leaders 3 years later took the initiative in forming the IWW. De Leonist dual unionist thinking predominated in the whole development. The establishment of the IWW brought about the first real crystallization of the left wing nationally within the Socialist Party, of those forces which, under new circumstances and with a sounder program, were to produce the Communist Party. The SP right-wing leadership condemned the IWW vigorously, as they had rejected the ALU, on the grounds that it compromised the position of the socialist forces in the trade unions. Between right and left the struggle sharpened over the basic question of trade unionism, with the IWW in the center of the fight. This quarrel was fated to become more and more intense as the spectacular history of the IWW developed during the next few years. The status of the party. Immediately upon its formation in 1901, the Socialist Party began to flourish. At its second convention, in May 1904, it had 184 delegates, representing 1,200 locals in 35 states. The party's dues-paying membership had doubled since 1901, now being 20,768. The party press was also growing rapidly, amounting at this period to several dailies in German and other non-English languages, 20 English weeklies, and 7 monthlies. The socialist workers were active in all strikes and organizing campaigns. They vigorously attacked Gompersism, and they carried on a militant anti-capitalist campaign. The party's trade union influence in consequence was rapidly on the rise, and its success in the 1904 national elections was significant. The SP's candidates, Eugene V. Debs and Ben Hanford, polled 409,230 votes, or about a 350% increase over the vote in 1900. Despite all this vigor and progress, however, the party was already beginning to feel the effects of numerous negative influences which were to undermine it and to prevent it from becoming the vanguard party of the working class. For one thing, The party was already attracting a large and motley array of doctors, lawyers, dentists, preachers, small businessmen, and other reformers and opportunists. These elements. 102. History of the Communist Party. The radical wing of the city middle class, then being crushed by the advancing trusts, hoped to make use of the proletarian membership and following of the party for their own ends, and they descended upon the Socialist Party in force. By concentrating upon innumerable opportunist partial demands and by damping down all militant struggle and revolutionary propaganda, they were transforming the party into a vehicle for middle-class reform. Closely allied with the reformists of the Second International, these elements fought against the party basing itself upon the industrial proletariat and developing an anti-capitalist program. Already by 1905, the petty bourgeois elements were busily consolidating their hold upon the party, a control which was to last throughout the life of the organization. The opportunist intellectuals were able to seize the leadership of the Socialist Party because the working-class left wing of the party, afflicted with sectarianism, lacked an effective program. Moreover, the bulk of the working-class members, who were foreign-born, had big language difficulties, and were split into more or less isolated national groups. Eventually, the language federations lacked the unity necessary to cope with the highly vocal middle-class opportunists. Not until World War I and the Russian Revolution, as we shall see, did the proletarian left wing of the party develop the program and solidarity necessary for it to become dominant in the Socialist Party. A specific grave weakness of the Socialist Party, largely a reaction against the former experience with the stifling over-centralization of the de Leonite regime in the SLP, was the extremely decentralized form of the party. Each state organization in the party did pretty much as it pleased, with little or no direction from the national center, except when it wanted to curb the left wing. National party discipline was almost at zero. The socialist press, privately owned, was also in chaos. The various papers propagated their own particular ideas of socialism and party policy. These ideas were many, various, conflicting, and often bizarre, ranging all the way from Christian socialism to leftist impossibilism. There was no established body of socialist thought, developed and defended by the party as such. This confused and undisciplined programmatic setup provided a perfect situation wherein the opportunists could peddle their wares, and they made the most of it. From the beginning, the SP leadership displayed a deep lack of appreciation of the role of Marxist theory. They were afflicted with so-called American practicality, devoting themselves almost exclusively to immediate tasks, combined with an abstract propagation of socialism. They and the party as a whole paid little attention to the theoretical and tactical struggles going on in the European parties. Another serious shortcoming of the party, also in evidence at the outset, was its sectarian attitude toward the Labour Party movement, local outcroppings of which were frequent. The National Executive Committee stated, on January 12, 1903, that any alliance, direct or indirect, with such Labour parties is dangerous to the political integrity and the very existence of the Socialist Party. The party leadership definitely considered the Labour Party a rival. This anti-Labour Party policy, a mixture of Deleonism and a right sectarian attempt to apply European social democratic policies artificially in the United States, was to continue in force in the SP for many years, until after World War I, and the appearance of the Communist Party upon the scene. Such a policy of abstention set up a high barrier between the SP and the spontaneous political movements of the masses, and it contributed much to the party's eventual isolation and failure. Dual unionism was a further weakness of the party. This trend was already strongly marked at the time of the party's foundation, as we have seen in the formation of the American Labor Union and the IWW. Dual unionism was particularly a disease of the left wing, one of the worst hangovers of Deleonism. Indeed, for a quarter of a century, from the launching of the American Railway Union by Debs in 1893 until Lenin's blistering attacks upon dual unionism in 1920, the left wing was hamstrung by the leftist notion that a new trade union movement could be established, in rivalry to the existing mass unions and on the basis of ideally constructed, socialist unions. The party's chauvinist Negro policy. Throughout its entire existence, the Socialist Party has had a chauvinist line on the Negro question. It has not only failed grievously to come to the assistance of the Negro people, harassed by lynching, Jim Crow, and a host of other discriminations and persecutions, but it has always completely misunderstood the theoretical nature of the question. Traditionally, it has been SP policy to ignore the national character of the Negro question and to present it all only as a class matter. The SP's sole answer to the oppressed Negro people was that they should vote the socialist ticket and hope for socialism. The SP could not see the Negro people as allies of the working class because of its opportunist sectarian policies toward the Negro masses. Neither could it understand the nature of the oppression of the Negro people because its leaders were blinded by the white chauvinist ideology of the ruling class. 104. History of the Communist Party. This policy, to ignore the special status of the Negro people as an oppressed people and to treat the matter only as a class question, which was also de Leon's policy, was already manifest in the founding convention of the Socialist Party in 1901. The resolution on the Negro question adopted by that convention proclaimed that we declare to the Negro worker the identity of his interests and struggles with the interests and struggles of all workers of all lands, without regard to race or color or sectional lines, that the only line of division which exists in fact is that between the producers and the owners of the world, between capitalism and labor. This policy, to consider the Negro people as proletarians, whereas about 8% of them worked on the land, mostly as sharecroppers, and to reduce their whole immediate problem primarily to one of trade unionism, was the policy of the party for many years, with but slight variations. The left wing of the party also did not rise very much above this narrow right-wing sectarian conception of the Negro question. While condemning lynching and insisting upon the admission of Negro workers to the industries and unions, the left did not work out special demands to meet the Negro people's most burning problems. Thus, when proposals were made in the party in 1903 to develop a Negro program, Debs opposed them, arguing, "We have nothing special to offer the Negro, and we cannot make separate appeals to all the races. The Socialist Party is the party of the whole working class regardless of color." Debs said also, on the Negro question, social equality, forsooth, is pure fraud and serves to mask the real issue, which is not social equality, but economic freedom. And, the Socialist platform has not a word in reference to social equality. Behind the failure of the Socialist Party from its outset to take up the Negro people's special grievances and to penetrate the South lay a very obvious white chauvinism, particularly among the petty bourgeois leadership within the party. This often found open and brutal expression in the party press. Thus, Victor Berger, in the Social Democratic Herald, in May 1902, stated that, "There can be no doubt that the Negroes and mulattoes constitute a lower race." And William Noyes, writing as a friend of the Negro, had an article in the International Socialist Review, reeking with outrageous and unquotable anti-Negro slander, repeating every slave owner insult and belittlement of this oppressed people. And nobody in the review challenged his chauvinism. Today, not even the most blatant white supremacist in the Deep South would dare to say publicly what Noyes, as a matter of course, wrote in 1901 openly in the socialist press. The fact that the constant expressions of white chauvinism on the part of the SP leaders did not provoke a bitter condemnation from the left showed that the Marxists in the party were themselves by no means clear about this deadly political disease. With such false policies and attitudes prevailing, small wonder then that the Negro members of the Socialist Party were few and far between and that the party's influence was negligible among the Negro masses. Opportunist influence of the Second International. Another detrimental influence upon the young Socialist Party, and one that was to continue to injure it from then on, was the opportunistic pressure of the Second International. During the period of the First International, 1864 to 1876, and for a decade thereafter, the American Marxists had the inestimable advantage of the direct advice of Marx and Engels. But with the development of the policy of the Second International into more and more of an opportunist position, after that body's foundation in 1889, the former revolutionary international leadership came to a sudden halt. The Marxists in the United States were cut off from the left forces in Europe and exposed to a full stream of revisionist poison. Although, at the turn of the century, there grew up in Russia a great socialist genius, Lenin, comparable to Karl Marx, the American Marxists down to World War I knew practically nothing about him and his writings, or of the growth of Bolshevism in Tsarist Russia. Even the Russian Revolution of 1905, filtered as it was through the interpretations of the opportunistic leaders of the Second International, impressed few major lessons upon the American Socialist Party. The Second International, with its parties, unions, cooperatives, and parliamentary groups growing rapidly in the 18 zeros, early developed reformist illusions to the effect that it was therefore in the process of establishing socialism step by step in various countries. Its leaders came to believe that Marx, with his perspective of a militant struggle for socialism, had become outmoded and obsolete. This right opportunism was an outgrowth of the developing imperialist stage of capitalism, with its markedly increased bribery and corruption of the labor aristocracy upon which the social democratic leadership mainly based itself. This revisionism took strong root in the most outstanding spokes. 106. History of the Communist Party. Man of the trend was Eduard Bernstein, in Germany. In 1899 he expressed his revisionist doctrines in his book, published in the United States under the title Evolutionary Socialism. Bernstein rejected the Marxist theories of surplus value, concentration of capital, the progressive pauperization of the working class, the class struggle, and the materialist conception of history, and he ridiculed the social revolution as the ultimate goal. In this period, Bebel and Kautsky in Germany, as well as Lenin, Plekhanov, and others in Russia and on an international scale, waged energetic war upon Bernsteinism. Nevertheless, it eventually became the predominant philosophy of the opportunist leaders of the Second International, with disastrous results to the working class movement in many countries. This reformist poison the Second International steadily pumped into the veins of the young American Socialist Party. Victor Berger, from the early 1900s, openly supported Bernsteinian revisionism through his paper in Milwaukee and in the party councils. Scores of other middle-class Socialist Party leaders in the United States took a similar position. Thus they sapped the very foundations of Marxism in the party. As in the Social Democratic Party of Germany and in the general leadership of the Second International, Bernsteinism, with specific national adaptations, became, as early as 1905, the predominant philosophy of the ruling group of intellectuals in the Socialist Party of America. Hillquit himself, however, was a centrist, a follower of Kautsky, who, as the sequel showed, was only a disguised brand of Bernsteinist.